They heard the stories long before they ever saw a German uniform. Reports drifted through briefing tents and muddy staging areas, accounts of armoured spearheads that struck with mechanical precision, infantry squads that moved like clockwork, and machine gun crews whose discipline could stop an entire company in its tracks. For many Americans arriving in Europe, the fear wasn't myth or rumour. It came from the wounded men returning from the front with thousand-yard stares and warnings that the real test was still ahead. Their first battles proved it true. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen pines of the Ardennes, and the fortified teeth of the Siegfried Line, US, soldiers faced an enemy drilled by years of combat. German units fought with coordination, speed, and stubborn endurance. Their weapons were engineered for dominance, their tactics shaped by hard lessons, and their veterans knew how to turn any field into a killing zone. This fear wasn't weakness, it was recognition. To break through this army would require grit, adaptation, and sacrifices that no one back home could fully understand. So tonight, lower the lights and listen closely. Picture the cold helmets, the shaking hands, the breath fogging inside cramped foxholes as the German artillery found its range. Subscribe and stay with me, and tell me where you're watching from, as we step into the battles where American soldiers learned why facing the Wehrmacht was one of the most sobering experiences of the entire war. They arrived on stretchers, on trucks, and sometimes walking under their own power, even though they shouldn't have been. Men from the first wave at Normandy, bandaged across the head or shoulder, boots torn, uniforms stiff with dried seawater and blood. They didn't talk much at first, not to the nurses, not to the officers, not even to the replacements waiting in the staging areas. But every now and then, when the cigarettes were lit and someone finally asked the question that had been sitting too heavy in the air, the stories began to come out. And for the new American soldiers who heard them, those stories became the first real warning of what awaited them across the Channel. They talked about how the German machine guns opened up the moment the ramps dropped, how the first bursts tore through the front ranks before anyone could even return fire. Some described hearing the rounds cutting the air so fast they couldn't distinguish individual shots, only a ripping sound, like canvas tearing in long, continuous shreds. Others spoke of the accuracy, crouching behind steel obstacles, watching bullets strike the same point again and again until the cover gave way. The name MG-42 wasn't said often, but everyone already knew it. The buzzsaw. The sound alone was enough to pin men to the sand. The wounded also spoke about the snipers, not just good marksman professionals who had been fighting since Poland or Russia. They described watching officers and radio men fall within seconds of stepping into view. One lieutenant said that any soldier foolish enough to lift his head for more than a heartbeat was inviting a bullet. Some of the wounded still reflexively ducked when a medic dropped a tray or a door slammed shut nearby. The fear lingered. Then there were the stories of the first German counterattacks. The replacements expected chaos from an enemy reacting to an invasion. Instead, the returning soldiers described something else entirely. Squads moving with precision, calling their shots, using the terrain as if they knew every blade of grass. German infantry would open fire, hit hard, then vanish into smoke or hedgerows, only to reappear on the flanks minutes later. "They don't stay where you put them," one corporal muttered. "They don't break. Not the way you expect." Armour was another topic that came up quietly, almost reluctantly. The Americans who had managed to get close to German positions talked about the heavy silhouettes of Panthers shifting in the tree lines, firing through narrow gaps that US tankers couldn't even see. They described rounds punching through Sherman hulls at distances that felt unfair, almost unreal. Some swore the German tanks were ghosts appearing, firing, and disappearing before the Americans could react. But the detail that unsettled the replacements most wasn't the weapons, the training, or the tactics. It was the expressions on the faces of the men telling the stories. These weren't green soldiers exaggerating a firefight. These were combat veterans men who had held their ground, pushed forward, and survived. And yet the fear in their voices was unmistakable. Not panic, not defeat. Something else, respect, sharpened by the knowledge of what the enemy was capable of. By the time the rumors finished spreading through the staging areas, the new arrivals understood one thing clearly. The German army wasn't just another opponent. It was a force shaped by years of war, hardened by victories and failures alike, disciplined enough to strike with precision, and smart enough to exploit weakness instantly. Facing them would demand more than courage. It would demand endurance, adaptation, and the willingness to walk into battles that would challenge every assumption a young soldier carried with him. And for many Americans, Chapter 1 of their war began with those whispered warnings long before they ever set foot on the battlefield. The men who landed after D-Day expected open fields, rolling pastures, and a clear view of the enemy. What they found instead was a landscape that swallowed entire companies whole. The hedgerows of Normandy weren't just bushes. They were ancient earthworks, walls of dirt and tangled roots, chest-high or taller, lined with thick vegetation dense enough to hide a platoon. For American soldiers fresh from training grounds in the States or the wide deserts of North Africa, the hedgerows became an immediate and punishing revelation. Contact with the enemy rarely happened at a distance. Moments after stepping into one of the narrow lanes, the sound of a single German rifle crack could freeze an entire squad. It wasn't just the shot itself, it was the uncertainty. No one knew which hedgerow it came from, or whether a machine gun team was waiting just a few feet ahead. Soldiers described the uncanny sensation of feeling watched from every direction, even in silence. The Germans had been preparing these positions for weeks in some areas, months, and they understood every angle. American patrols quickly discovered that the hedgerows weren't natural cover, they were traps. Advancing through them meant climbing over mounds of earth, exposing torsos for only a second, but 1 second was enough. German marksmen were patient. Rifle grenades arced quietly over from unseen positions. Sometimes the first warning came from the dull thud of an explosion somewhere in the distance, followed by the sudden snapping of branches far too close for comfort. Machine guns remained the most feared. MG-42 teams dug into hedgerow corners, would wait for the perfect moment, often when an American squad moved into an opening or tried to cross a narrow gap. Then the hedgerow erupted. The burst was deafening inside confined terrain, echoing so violently it was impossible to tell where the gun was. Soldiers recalled the panic of diving into ditches already crowded with wounded men, praying the next burst didn't walk its way down the line. There was also the matter of coordination. U.S. troops often fought blind, unsure of what lay even 10 feet ahead. The Germans, however, had pre-sighted their positions with meticulous attention. One hedgerow might conceal a rifle squad, while the next one contained a machine gun, and the one beyond that held a mortar team. Any attempt to attack a single position often triggered fire from 2 others. It felt less like fighting enemies scattered across the countryside, and more like confronting a single, interconnected system. Armor didn't fare much better. Sherman tanks, with their high silhouettes, became easy marks. Panther crews waited for the tanks to crest hedgerow mounds before firing. Sometimes the shot came from so close that American tankers reported seeing dirt fall from the vegetation with the recoil of the German gun. Infantry had to guide tanks with hand signals inch by inch, forward into terrain where every bend could hide a Panzerfaust team. Even when the Americans managed to advance, the price was high. Platoons dissolved under crossfire. Communications broke down as runners were forced to crawl along ditches instead of sprinting across open ground. What should have been a fast breakout became a grinding, claustrophobic struggle for every yard. By the end of June, many U.S. soldiers had gained a new, sobering respect for the German defenders. It wasn't just the weapons or the training, it was the way the enemy used the terrain as if it were an extension of their own bodies. The hedgerows taught the Americans one of their earliest and most painful lessons of the war. The German army excelled at turning even the gentlest countryside into a lethal battlefield. In Normandy, fear wasn't abstract. It was the wall of tangled roots right in front of them, and whatever waited silently behind it. The first time most American soldiers heard the MG-42, they didn't immediately recognize it as a machine gun. It didn't bark in steady, familiar bursts. Like the Browning, it didn't sound like automatic fire at all. Veterans described it as a ripping, continuous shriek, a metallic tearing that rolled across the battlefield so fast it blurred into a single, unbroken sound. For new troops, that noise became a shock all its own, one that carried farther and cut deeper than any weapon they had encountered before. The Germans didn't just fire the MG42, they built tactics around it. Crews drilled until every man knew his job without being told. The gunner tracked targets, the assistant fed belts with practiced rhythm, and the ammunition carriers rotated in and out with seconds to spare. The weapon's blistering rate of fire, over 1,000 rounds per minute, meant barrels overheated quickly. But the Germans solved that too. A trained crew could swap a burning hot barrel for a fresh one in under 10 seconds, barely interrupting the stream of fire. For U.S. infantry advancing through hedgerows, forests, or ruined towns, the gun's impact was immediate. A single MG42 could halt an entire platoon. The moment the weapon opened up, men dropped into ditches, hugged dirt, or scrambled behind whatever cover they could find. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival. The weapon's rounds came so fast that soldiers swore they could feel the air snap around them. Some described the terrifying moment when bullets clipped leaves or chewed through gateposts inches from their helmets, carving straight lines through foliage as though drawn with a ruler. The psychological shock was just as real as the physical threat. U.S. troops were used to identifying enemy positions by sound. The MG42 broke that rule. Its fire echoed violently against stone, trees, and terrain, masking its location. One burst might seem close. The next might ricochet from another direction entirely. Many American units resorted to sending scouts forward, crawling on their stomachs for yards at a time, trying to spot muzzle flashes hidden in shadows or camouflaged nests. In defense, German units placed the guns with mathematical precision. Every sector overlapped. Every approach was covered. A squad of riflemen existed mainly to protect the machine gun teams, not the other way around. For attacking Americans, this meant walking into carefully constructed kill zones. Even when they tried flanking maneuvers, secondary MG42 positions often opened up, catching the movement from an angle no one had anticipated. It wasn't only infantry who feared the weapon. American tank crews reported hearing its bursts hammering against their armor, like handfuls of gravel thrown by a giant. The rounds couldn't penetrate a Sherman's hull, but they could smash optics, kill exposed crewmen, or pin infantry who were supposed to support the tanks. Without infantry cover, a tank became a large, blind target, and the Germans knew it. Over time, American units learned to adapt. They used suppressive fire from Browning heavy machine guns, coordinated mortar teams to blanket likely positions, and relied heavily on artillery barrages to soften resistance before advancing. But these solutions came from experience, and experience cost lives. Each lesson was paid for by men who had faced the MG42's fury firsthand. Yet even as American soldiers grew more confident, one truth remained unchanged. The sound of the MG42 never stopped being unnerving. Veterans recalled that long after the war, hearing a sheet of tin tear or a branch snap sharply in the woods could bring back the memory of that weapon, the weapon that dominated every battlefield it touched. For U.S. soldiers in Europe, fear had a sound. It was the ripping, relentless voice of the German MG42. Long before American soldiers set foot in Europe, the German army had already been shaped by years of continuous, brutal warfare. The men U.S. troops faced in 1944 were not inexperienced recruits learning their first lessons under fire. They were veterans, many hardened by campaigns that stretched back to the invasion of Poland, through the Blitz across France, and deep into the killing fields of the Eastern Front. To the Americans, arriving fresh from stateside training camps, this experience gap was not theoretical. It was visible, tangible, and deadly. The veterans of Poland had been introduced to the fast, coordinated strikes that defined early German warfare, armoured thrusts supported by mechanized infantry, dive bomber attacks, and lightning encirclements. They learned how to break an enemy line before the defenders even understood what was happening. Those same soldiers brought their knowledge westward, facing the British and French in 1940, refining their ability to exploit terrain, isolate enemy units, and target communications. For them, war was not a new challenge. It was a familiar craft they had been practicing for years. But the Eastern Front shaped them in ways no American could fully grasp until meeting them in combat. Germany's war against the Soviet Union was a crucible of extremes, vast distances, unforgiving winters, and combat so constant that survival itself became a skill. Veteran German squads learned to fight while freezing, starving, and exhausted. They fought through ambushes, counter-offensives, tank battles, and house-to-house struggles in ruined cities. Every day on the Eastern Front sharpened instincts that would later be turned against American forces. These men brought with them a particular kind of battlefield calm. U.S. soldiers noted that German veterans rarely panicked. Under artillery fire, they hugged the earth and waited, counting seconds between impacts. When a flank collapsed, they repositioned without shouting or confusion. When American units attacked with overwhelming numbers, German troops didn't crumble. They shifted, reformed, and counterattacked with precision born of repetition. The enemy the Americans faced was not simply trained, he was forged. There was also a discipline in German movement that felt unnatural to American eyes. Veterans from Russia approached firefights with calculated patience. They didn't waste ammunition. They didn't fire unless they knew they could hit something. They maneuvered in small groups, communicating with hand signals rather than yelling. A single German squad could hold off a much larger American force if positioned correctly. And they were usually positioned correctly. Even their defensive preparations bore the marks of long experience. Foxholes were dug deep, angled to protect from shrapnel. Machine gun nests were sited with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams knew how to mask their positions with smoke or false cover. Mines were placed where retreating Americans might step rather than where advancing soldiers expected them. Every battlefield the Germans touched reflected years of accumulated knowledge. To American units encountering these veterans for the first time, the shock was immediate. A young rifleman could sense the difference instantly. The soldiers across the line did not act like men fighting their first battle. They acted like men who had survived hundreds. They wasted no movement. They gave no easy targets. Their confidence under fire made them seem, at times, unshakable. This gap in experience was one of the earliest and most sobering realizations American troops made in Europe. They weren't fighting a collapsing army. They weren't fighting amateurs. They were facing survivors, veterans who had already endured wars far more savage than anything the Americans had yet seen. And on those first days in France, that simple truth became one of the deepest sources of fear. The idea of the German super soldier didn't start in newspapers or propaganda films. It began in foxholes, in aid stations, and in the whispered conversations of American troops who had seen the enemy up close for the first time. The myth grew naturally from fear, uncertainty, and the shock of realizing that the opponent they faced wasn't merely competent, he was practiced, confident, and strikingly effective under fire. In the early weeks of the Normandy campaign, this belief hardened into something that spread through entire companies before any official briefing ever tried to counter it. For many Americans, the first encounters fed this perception. They watched German machine gun teams respond to contact with a level of synchronization they had never witnessed before. One man shifted the barrel, another swapped ammunition belts, and a third covered the approach, all in seamless rhythm, as if rehearsed. It wasn't magic. It was training, experience, and repetition. But to a young private crouched in the mud, it looked like something more. Reports circulated of German soldiers who could fire rifles with deadly accuracy at ranges Americans struggled with. Men talked about ambushes that sprang open and closed with ruthless precision, leaving U.S. patrols unable to identify a single shooter. Others repeated stories of German units holding positions long after logic said they should have withdrawn. When American advances stalled against a handful of defenders, the narrative grew even stronger. The enemy wasn't just well prepared, he was exceptional. Part of the myth came from the Americans' own expectations. Many had grown up seeing the German army of World War I portrayed as rigid and methodical. They didn't expect fluid tactics, rapid counterattacks, or decentralized decision-making. When German NCOs led flanking moves without waiting for officer approval, U.S. troops interpreted it as a sign of elite brilliance rather than the doctrine it truly was. The landscape magnified the illusion. In the hedgerows, German defenders seemed to appear and vanish at will. A burst of automatic fire would open from one side of a field, and before American troops could flank the position, another burst echoed from the opposite direction. The truth was that German squads had scouted their sectors thoroughly and positioned fallback nests long before the first Allied soldier arrived. But from the American perspective, it felt like fighting an enemy who was everywhere at once. Captured German soldiers contributed unintentionally to the myth. Many were young, tired, and shaken, but they still maintained discipline and composure. Some spoke confidently about their previous campaigns. Others explained their tactics with a matter-of-fact tone that unnerved their interrogators. The impression lingered. If even the prisoners showed this much poise, what must the veterans still in the field be like? American commanders worked to push back against this growing narrative, reminding their troops that German units had weaknesses like any other army. But the myth had already taken root, strengthened by every ambush, every stalled advance, every casualty. Fear rarely waits for confirmation. It fills in the blanks on its own. In time, American soldiers learned that the super soldier image was just that, an image. The German army was skilled, disciplined, and dangerous, but not invincible. Yet during those early engagements, before experience replaced speculation, the myth played a powerful role. It shaped expectations, it heightened caution, it increased the psychological weight every U.S. soldier carried into battle. And while myths can fade, the fear that created them often lingers far longer, embedded in the memory of the men who faced an enemy they believed, for a moment, to be something beyond human. For many American soldiers, the first time they truly understood the meaning of German firepower was not from infantry engagements, but from the sight of German armor emerging from smoke, tree lines, or the edges of quiet villages. The U.S. Army had prepared its men to face tanks, but preparation couldn't fully match reality. Not when the enemy's armored vehicles, Panthers, Tigers, and well-handled Panzer IVs carried reputations that spread faster than any briefing could keep up with. The first encounters often came without warning. A Sherman crew would be easing its way through a hedgerow opening when a single sharp crack echoed across the field. A heartbeat later, a fiery plume punched out of the tank's side armor, blowing the hatch open and forcing surviving crewmen to scramble into the dirt. The shot might have come from several hundred yards away, a range at which German optics gave their gunners a clear, crisp view, while American crews peered through glass that fogged, scratched, or distorted under battlefield stress. Panthers were the most common shock. Their sloped frontal armor could deflect Sherman shells that struck head-on, leading many American tankers to claim it felt like firing pebbles at a steel barn. A Sherman needed to flank the Panther, hitting from the side or rear to stand a chance. But terrain rarely cooperated. Hedgerows and narrow lanes limited maneuvering, turning tank duels into deadly games of patience, where the first to fire usually won. Tigers were a different experience entirely. They were rare, but their reputation did not require numbers to spread. Stories circulated of Tigers knocking out multiple Shermans in minutes, hitting targets at distances Americans considered impossible. Some units reported hearing the deep, heavy clank of a Tiger's movement long before they saw it, a sound that made crews freeze, realizing they were up against something designed not just to dominate, but to intimidate. Infantry struggled just as much. A Panther positioned behind cover could halt an entire battalion's advance. Its long-barreled cannon could strike with precision, forcing American troops to flatten themselves against the earth while artillery was called in. Sometimes help arrived in time, sometimes it didn't, and when it didn't, soldiers faced the fear of watching a tank pivot slowly toward them, coaxial machine guns warming up, the turrets swinging with an almost mechanical patience. Even damaged German tanks were dangerous. Crews were trained to fire until the last possible moment, and they often did. A burning Panther might still shoot a round at a retreating squad. A disabled Panzer IV could hold off American infantry with its machine guns long enough to allow its crew to escape. German tankers understood how to use terrain better than many expected. They positioned their vehicles hull down, concealed in shadows, or angled to maximize ricochet potential. American forces adapted over 50 times. Artillery barrages, air support, and bazookas eventually helped even the odds. But these solutions came only after hard lessons, after the shock of realizing that German armor wasn't a theoretical threat. It was a presence felt across every front line, shaping the pace of battle, dictating tactics, and reminding U.S. troops that the enemy they faced had spent years perfecting armored warfare. For the average American soldier seeing German armor for the first time, the impression was unforgettable. These machines were not merely weapons. They were instruments of psychological pressure, symbols of an enemy whose engineering, training, and battlefield experience set a standard few had anticipated. And the fear they generated, especially in the early months, was very real, carved into memory, with every thunderous shot that echoed across the hedgerows of Europe. American troops arriving in Europe expected that German infantry would fight with determination, but they were not prepared for the level of coordination and discipline they encountered on the ground. What U.S. soldiers initially perceived as almost uncanny precision was, in reality, the product of a doctrine that treated every squad as a self-contained machine, well-practiced, flexible, and built around the deadly efficiency of its weapons. The result was an opponent whose smallest element could disrupt entire American platoons. A standard German infantry squad centered its strength on the machine gun. The MG-42 was not merely a support weapon. It was the core around which every other movement was designed. While American squads often relied on rifle fire, with the BAR in a supporting role, German doctrine reversed that logic. The machine gun dominated, and the rifleman protected it. This single difference created a dramatic mismatch in early encounters. American soldiers quickly saw the results in combat. When a German squad opened fire, the coordination was immediate. The gunner fired controlled bursts, sweeping likely avenues of approach with terrifying speed. The assistant gunner counted belts, monitored barrel temperature, and signaled shifts in fire. Riflemen fanned out with methodical purpose, covering flanks, watching for American attempts to maneuver, and communicating through hand signals rather than shouted orders. To U.S. troops, this silence was unnerving. German squads rarely spoke once engaged. Movements that required shouted commands in American units took place quietly and precisely among the Germans, as if rehearsed. Even under mortar fire or sudden American counterattacks, they maintained their structure. Veterans from the Eastern Front carried habits sharpened by years of brutal combat: stay low, move only when necessary, and never fire without a clear purpose. The effect was devastating in close terrain. In hedgerows, forests, and urban ruins, a single German squad could stall much larger forces. A machine gun positioned at an angle could hold down an entire American platoon. Attempts to flank often ran into overlapping fields of fire, not by accident, but by design. German NCOs were trained to think independently. If one angle failed, they shifted to another. If their position became compromised, they withdrew in coordinated bounds, leaving behind mines, tripwires, or a sniper covering their retreat. American soldiers spoke of their first firefights with German infantry with a mixture of frustration and respect. They recalled advancing under what felt like controlled, measured fire, never too heavy, never too light, always adjusted based on their movements. They remembered seeing German riflemen move with caution rather than panic, picking positions that maximized their fields of fire. Even inexperienced German units displayed this discipline, because the doctrine itself demanded it. the Germans were also adept at counterattacks. A squad would hold a position just long enough to slow an American advance, then fall back to a secondary hedgerow or trench where a second machine gun team waited. When American troops pushed forward believing they had won ground, the Germans struck from fresh angles. These small, sharp counterattacks created the impression that German lines were deeper and more coordinated than they actually were. This discipline extended to night operations. German infantry moved at dusk or dawn when visibility was poor, relying on careful pacing and memorized routes. American pickets reported hearing whispers, then the rustling of boots, and then sudden bursts of activity as German squads tested the perimeter for weaknesses. Their ability to execute these operations with confidence added to the psychological burden U.S. troops carried. What American soldiers encountered in German infantry was not invincibility, but efficiency, the kind born of training that emphasized initiative, fire control, and relentless cohesion. The fear came not from any one soldier, but from the sense that every German squad knew exactly what it was doing, even in chaos. And on battlefield after battlefield, that discipline forced American troops to rethink what it meant to fight a well-prepared, well-practiced enemy, one determined to make every yard of ground cost more than anyone had expected. American soldiers were often surprised to learn that the German army, known in the First World War for rigidity and strict hierarchy, had, by the Second World War, become one of the most tactically flexible forces on the battlefield. This was not accidental. It was the result of a doctrine that encouraged quick decision-making, trusted non-commissioned officers, and expected every soldier to adapt when conditions changed. For U.S. troops encountering this system for the first time, the shift in enemy behavior could feel almost disorienting. The first sign of this flexibility appeared during firefights that didn't follow predictable patterns. American units were accustomed to set-piece engagements, identify the enemy, lay down suppressive fire, maneuver on flanks, close the distance. But German defenders rarely stayed where American soldiers expected them to be. A machine gun nest would fire long enough to pin a squad down, but by the time U.S. troops approached the position, the crew had already fallen back to a second prepared line. Riflemen didn't wait for orders from officers who might be out of sight. NCOs adjusted on the spot, shifting men from one hedgerow to another, repositioning their machine guns, or preparing ambushes based on what they observed in real time. American patrols also noticed something that contradicted every stereotype they had heard. German soldiers didn't fight like automatons. They didn't wait for detailed instructions. They didn't cling to a plan once it stopped working. Instead, small groups acted with surprising independence. A corporal might lead a flanking maneuver if he saw an opening. A private might relocate a machine gun position if the angle wasn't ideal. This fluid approach made the German army extraordinarily difficult to pin down. In urban fighting, the effect was even more apparent. During battles in places like Saint-Lô, Aachen, and the ruins of countless French villages, German troops shifted through buildings with silent discipline. They used back alleys, cellar doors, and breach points created by tank shells. A house that American infantry cleared in the morning might be reoccupied by German troops from a completely different direction by the afternoon. Each movement seemed coordinated even when it wasn't. German soldiers were simply trained to take initiative and exploit opportunity when they saw it. This culture extended to defensive operations as well. When American artillery began pounding a German position, the defenders didn't wait passively in their foxholes. They pulled back, regrouped, and often returned to the same spot once the shelling moved on. They understood the rhythm of American fire missions and used that rhythm against them. Some units also left behind small sniper teams or anti-tank crews specifically trained to hit advancing troops or armor, just as the barrage lifted a tactic that inflicted heavy losses on inexperienced American infantry. The adaptability of German troops reflected the leadership structure within their ranks. NCOs carried real authority. Sergeants were trained to think like junior officers. If their lieutenant fell, the squad didn't lose cohesion. Someone stepped in immediately, maintaining momentum. By contrast, early American units sometimes stalled when officers were hit, simply because leadership training hadn't yet filtered deeply into the lower ranks. This imbalance wasn't due to a lack of courage on the American side. It was a structural difference, one that took time to overcome. As U.S. forces gained experience, the gap narrowed. But in those first crucial months, whenever an American unit thought it understood the layout of a fight, German troops shifted their tactics just enough to throw everything into confusion. To many U.S. soldiers, especially those facing combat for the first time, it felt as though the German army anticipated every move. The truth was more grounded. German doctrine expected every soldier to solve problems on the spot. That made the enemy unpredictable, resilient, and perhaps most unsettling of all, capable of turning a simple engagement into a rapidly evolving test of survival. In those early battles, American troops learned a difficult lesson. They were not facing a rigid force. They were facing one of the most tactically flexible armies of the war, and that flexibility made every fight more dangerous than they had imagined. American troops quickly learned that German artillery was not something they could simply outrun, outmaneuver, or wait out. It struck fast, precisely, and often with a timing that seemed impossible for an army under pressure. What many U.S. soldiers didn't realize until they experienced it firsthand was that German artillery operations were supported by an extraordinarily efficient system of observers, communication networks, and disciplined firing procedures, a system refined through years of war across Europe and the Eastern Front. The first sign of German artillery proficiency usually came with a single round landing uncomfortably close. The impact wasn't random. It was a ranging shot, a deliberate test to see where American troops were positioned. Within seconds, another round followed, adjusted slightly, then another. Once the German observer confirmed the range, the full barrage began. American soldiers described the terrifying speed with which the Germans shifted from initial spotting to accurate, sustained fire. Mortar shells would rain down on advancing infantry. Larger artillery pieces struck roads, crossroads, and hedgerow gaps, where U.S. units naturally clustered. Troops trying to take cover sometimes found that the Germans had anticipated exactly where they would run. One reason for this precision was the German use of forward observers, disciplined men trained to call in fire missions quickly and accurately. These observers were often positioned in church towers, on hilltops, inside barns, or even in concealed tree nests. They carried rangefinders, detailed maps, and field radios that allowed them to relay corrections in seconds. Even when American troops believed they had neutralized these posts, another observer would appear from a different angle, continuing the deadly coordination. The speed of German adjustments shocked many American officers. Their artillery doctrine emphasized methodical preparation. German artillery, by contrast, was designed for rapid reactive fire. If an American platoon was spotted moving across open ground, German batteries could respond within minutes. If a U.S. tank column paused to regroup, observers marked their position and called in volleys, specifically targeting stationary armor. American tank crews described hearing shells whistling directly toward them before they even realized an observer had them in sight. German mortar teams were another source of fear. Their light and medium mortars were mobile, fast to deploy, and devastating in close-range engagements. A sudden thump in the distance often heralded a tight cluster of explosions seconds later adjusted with startling accuracy. Mortar crews trained relentlessly, practicing until they could shift fire by meters with minimal delay. Because of this, American units rarely lingered once they suspected a German mortar team was nearby. What made German artillery particularly dangerous was how well it integrated with infantry and armor. Machine gun teams pinned American troops in place. Observers then called fire onto the immobilized units. Tanks waited until artillery forced U.S. soldiers into the open. Every attack or retreat risked attracting shells. For many American infantrymen, the barrage felt less like a separate threat and more like an extension of the German soldiers firing at them. The psychological effect was profound. Men who had endured shelling described the helplessness of lying flat as the earth shook around them, the ground raining dirt and shrapnel. Some spoke of the eerie moment between impacts, when the silence was almost worse than the explosions themselves, because they knew the next adjustment was coming closer, more precise. Over time, American forces improved their counter-battery efforts. Radar detection, air spotting, and aggressive patrols targeting forward observers slowly eroded the German advantage. But in the early months, before those tactics matured, German artillery shaped the battlefield in ways that left deep impressions on the men who survived it. To those U.S. soldiers, German artillery didn't just strike hard. It struck with a frightening intelligence, fast, deliberate, and always a step ahead. Before a single shot was fired, before a soldier saw his first German helmet or heard the ripping burst of an MG-42, there was already a weight pressing on every American unit entering Europe, a persistent, gnawing fear of what they didn't know. It was the kind of tension that spread quietly through staging areas, bivouacs, and briefings. Even veterans of North Africa and Italy admitted privately that Western Europe felt different, heavier, as though the enemy waiting for them was unlike anything they had faced before. And in many ways, that feeling wasn't wrong. Rumours filled the gaps long before facts did. Soldiers heard fragments of stories, a platoon wiped out in minutes, tanks destroyed by a single hidden gun, patrols disappearing into forests without a trace. None of these stories were fully verified, but each one grew in the retelling. Every missing detail allowed imaginations to create something worse. The Germans were everywhere. They could see in the dark. They never retreated. They moved silently. They shot with impossible accuracy. The myth grew not from propaganda, but from uncertainty. And uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. The geography of northern France only amplified the problem. The hedgerows looked peaceful from a distance, like something out of a countryside postcard. But American soldiers quickly learned that behind each wall of roots and brush could be a sniper, a machine gun nest, or an entire squad waiting for the perfect moment to open fire. The terrain seemed deliberately designed to hide the enemy. Every field felt like a trap, every lane like a funnel, every wooded patch like a curtain concealing an unknown number of rifles. U.S. patrols often advanced with their weapons raised, listening for the smallest sound out of place. A snapped twig, a cough, the click of a metal clasp. Yet the Germans rarely revealed themselves early. They let the Americans come closer, studying their movements, waiting for the precise instant when the first burst would create maximum confusion. This silence, this patience, was more unnerving than any open confrontation. Men braced for ambushes at every turn, and tension alone exhausted entire companies before combat even began. Even the enemy's appearance fed the fear. Captured Germans varied wildly. Some were young, barely more than boys. Others were scarred veterans with hollow eyes hardened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front. Some prisoners were confident, others seemed resigned. Their unpredictability, their refusal to fit into a single, understandable mold, made it harder for American troops to form a clear image of who exactly they were fighting. Equipment added another layer of uncertainty. Americans didn't always know what weapons they might face. Was there an MG-42 behind the next hedgerow? A sniper with a Kar 98K perched in the branches above? A panther waiting around a bend? The Germans' ability to conceal their assets meant U.S. soldiers rarely felt informed. They felt hunted. Nighttime deepened the fear. German troops were experienced in moving under cover of darkness, a skill sharpened on the vast steppes of Russia. American units heard footsteps they couldn't locate, saw shadows they couldn't identify, and spent sleepless hours gripping rifles as nerves frayed. In those hours, imagination became the enemy. Every soldier knew that somewhere out there, Germans were crawling, listening, preparing. But the most unsettling part was this: the Germans were not strangers to the battlefield. They were veterans of campaigns stretching back years. The Americans, in contrast, were often fighting in Europe for the first time. The imbalance of experience intensified the fear. It wasn't just the enemy they worried about, it was the unknown shaped by that enemy's history, discipline, and lethal efficiency. The fear of the unknown didn't fade after the first firefight. If anything, it grew, because once Americans saw what the Germans could do, they realized their imagination hadn't been exaggerating, it had been holding back. Long before American troops met German forces on the battlefield, the men they would fight had already passed through a training system designed to produce discipline, endurance, and absolute familiarity with combat fundamentals. The Wehrmacht's training program was not glamorous. It was not inspirational. It was not even particularly modern. But it was effective, brutally effective, and it created soldiers who moved, thought, and fought with a precision that startled many US units during their first engagements in Europe. German training began with physical conditioning. Recruits marched for hours with full equipment, often over uneven ground, sometimes at forced pace. They dug trenches until their hands bled. They ran obstacle courses designed to break those who lacked stamina. This physical preparation wasn't simply for fitness, it conditioned soldiers to move confidently under the weight of packs, ammunition, and weapons they would carry into battle. Many American soldiers, despite solid training of their own, noted with irritation that German infantry seemed less fatigued during long engagements, able to sprint, reposition, or counterattack even after hours of fighting. Weapons proficiency was another cornerstone. German recruits drilled relentlessly with their rifles, learning to load, fire, clear jams, and correct sighting errors with mechanical consistency. They practiced snap shooting at moving targets and firing from awkward positions, habits forged from lessons learned on the Eastern Front. They trained with grenades, machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons long before they ever saw combat. As a result, even inexperienced German soldiers handled equipment with a confidence that made them appear more seasoned than they were. But the true strength of German training was not physical or technical, it was philosophical. The Wehrmacht taught its soldiers Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. Rather than waiting for precise orders, soldiers were taught to understand the intent behind commands and take initiative when conditions changed. NCOs were expected to act like leaders, not followers. Privates were expected to think, not simply obey. This doctrine resulted in battlefield flexibility that American troops initially mistook for elite-level intelligence. German recruits trained in small squads that emphasized teamwork. Machine gun crews learned to move as a single unit. Riflemen practiced advancing under covering fire, shifting positions in silence, and protecting the machine gun at all costs. These drills were repeated until they became instinct. In battle, this cohesion made even under-strength German squads formidable opponents. When one man fell, another stepped seamlessly into his role. Field exercises hammered home one lesson above all: expect chaos. Recruits trained in simulated confusion, dense smoke, uneven terrain, shouted commands drowned by explosions. They practiced fighting without officers, responding instead to immediate threats. They rehearsed quick withdrawals and counterattacks, building confidence in situations where many armies struggled. German training also bred emotional resilience. Recruits were taught, bluntly, that hardship, loss, and exhaustion were unavoidable. They learned to operate on minimal sleep, endure harsh weather, and maintain discipline even when hungry or overextended. Veterans later noted that this stoicism often unnerved American soldiers encountering German prisoners who seemed unfazed despite wounds or capture. What made this training system particularly impactful was the timing. By the time American forces entered France, many German units had years of combat experience layered on top of this foundation. But even the replacements the young men rushed to reinforce depleted divisions had undergone enough training to function effectively within their squads. For U.S. troops facing them, the result was unmistakable. German soldiers reacted quickly, moved smartly, and fought with a steadiness that came not from natural ability, but from a system designed to create battlefield competence at scale. And as American soldiers listened to the clipped, coordinated shouts of German units maneuvering under fire, they realized something that would shape their respect and fear for the enemy. The Wehrmacht didn't rely on extraordinary men. It relied on ordinary men trained extraordinarily well. To American infantrymen, the MG-42 was already a terrifying weapon, fast, violent, and psychologically overwhelming. But what made it truly dominant on the battlefield was not the gun itself. It was the machine built around it, the crew. A German MG team operated less like a group of individual soldiers and more like a single, coordinated instrument whose speed and discipline could disrupt entire American platoons. Understanding how these crews worked became essential for U.S. units trying to survive their first engagements with them. A standard MG-42 crew consisted of at least 3 men, though in practice more soldiers supported it. The gunner, the assistant gunner, and the ammunition carrier formed the core. But squads often added extra ammo carriers, riflemen to guard the flanks, and a second or even third gun nearby to create interlocking fire. This structure meant that whenever American troops believed they had located a single machine gun nest, they were usually facing a network, not an isolated threat. The gunner was the heart of the system. He trained relentlessly to control the weapon's violent recoil and extreme rate of fire. Though the MG-42 could spray over 1,000 rounds per minute, trained gunners never wasted ammunition. They fired in short, crisp bursts, adjusting angles with subtle wrist movements that swept kill zones with frightening precision. American soldiers noted that German gunners rarely fired blindly. Their bursts were purposeful, targeted, and timed to catch troops as they moved, not while they remained safely behind cover. The assistant gunner was just as crucial. His job was to feed belts, swap overheated barrels, watch the rear, and call out adjustments. Barrel changes were done in seconds, a process American troops often misinterpreted as multiple guns firing. Under fire, the assistant gunner moved with an efficiency that belied the chaos around him. He kept the weapon alive, shifting ammunition, clearing stoppages, and ensuring the gun never fell silent unless absolutely necessary. Behind them, ammunition carriers formed the engine that kept the weapon running. Each MG-42 burned through belts at a speed that could shock inexperienced American troops, but German logistics planners anticipated this. Ammo carriers crawled forward under fire, dragging boxes of belts, swapping in fresh supplies, and pulling spent casings out of the way. Even when the gun shifted positions something, it did, often the carriers kept pace, maintaining a steady supply, regardless of how fluid the fight became. American units quickly learned that German machine gun crews didn't stay fixed in one spot. The MG-42 was designed to be mobile. After delivering a burst to pin down an American squad, the crew would relocate a short distance, sometimes as little as 20 feet, to an alternate position. When U.S. troops maneuvered toward where they thought the gun was, they often walked straight into another burst from a slightly different angle. This mobility made it feel like there were multiple guns firing, when in reality a single coordinated crew was controlling the fight. The German belief that the machine gun was the squad's primary weapon shaped every aspect of their tactics. Riflemen did not advance unless the machine gun was covering them. They did not retreat unless the machine gun broke contact first. They did not fire unless doing so supported the gun. This doctrine created squads that fought as cohesive, integrated units, rather than loose collections of riflemen. American infantrymen described firefights where it seemed as though the Germans always had the advantage. The truth was simpler. German squads built everything around the MG-42, while American squads built around individual rifles. In open ground, in hedgerows, in forests, and in ruined cities, this difference tilted battles heavily toward the Germans in the early months. The fear the MG-42 inspired came not only from its sound or its velocity, but from the knowledge that behind it was a disciplined, coordinated crew, a small team capable of dictating the flow of an entire engagement. U.S. troops learned, often painfully, that defeating such a system required overwhelming fire, careful coordination, and no small amount of luck. And for many American units, the first sight of an MG-42 crew in action marked the moment they understood just how formidable the German army truly was. For many American tank crews entering combat in France, the first real shock was discovering that the enemy's armoured vehicles weren't just stronger, they were operating on an entirely different level. Panthers and Tigers had already gained a reputation among Allied forces, but rumours could never fully prepare a crew for the moment they faced one in the field. These tanks didn't simply outgun the Shermans, they outranged them, outsighted them, and often dictated the terms of every engagement from the very first shot. The Panther, officially the Panzerkampfwagen V, represented the most common heavy threat. Its frontal armour, sloped and reinforced, was thick enough to shrug off 75mm Sherman rounds at distances where American crews expected clean penetrations. Tankers described firing shot after shot, only to watch their rounds spark harmlessly off the Panther's glacis. Meanwhile, the Panther's own 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through a Sherman from well over 1,000 yards away. American tankers often said it felt unfair, like fighting an opponent who could see farther, shoot straighter, and hit harder before the Shermans were even close enough to return fire effectively. Then there were the Tigers. Heavier, rarer, and even more intimidating, the Tiger I carried the infamous 88mm gun that was originally designed for anti-aircraft use. On the ground, it became one of the most feared weapons of the war. A Tiger could knock out a Sherman with a single, precise hit at ranges where American tanks struggled to even identify their targets. U.S. Soldiers remembered hearing the deep bark of the Tiger's gun long before they saw the vehicle itself, a sound that often meant someone wouldn't make it home. The psychological effect was immediate and lasting. American crews entered combat knowing that if a Panther or Tiger spotted them first, the engagement was essentially over. This asymmetry created a constant sense of vulnerability. Tankers scanned every ridgeline and tree line with heightened tension, knowing that German armour could be lurking just beyond sight. Infantrymen, too, felt the pressure. A single Panther positioned well could halt an entire battalion's advance, its gun covering roads, fields, and choke points with lethal precision. The terrain of France only heightened the danger. Panthers often used hull-down positions, exposing only their turrets, while hiding their already formidable frontal armour behind hedgerows or low-rises. Tigers, thanks to their weight and stability, fired accurately even while partially concealed. American tank destroyer crews found themselves in deadly duels where one mistake, one exposed movement meant instant destruction. Many veteran tankers openly admitted that when they heard the report of a German high-velocity gun, they reacted with instinctive dread. American forces eventually learned to adapt. They called in artillery to blind German tanks with smoke. They relied heavily on air support, summoning P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons to target German armour from above. They coordinated infantry, bazooka teams, and tank destroyers to flank Panthers and Tigers where their armour was weaker. But these adaptations came later after painful losses, after too many burning Shermans, after too many crews who never stood a chance. For the average American tanker in the summer of 1944, the Panther and Tiger problem was more than a tactical challenge. It was a daily reminder that the enemy had spent years refining armoured warfare and that the Germans' best machines could dominate any battlefield they entered. Facing those tanks wasn't just frightening, it was an education in the hard realities of mechanized war one paid for in steel, fire, and lives. For American infantry and tank crews fighting their way across France, one of the most unsettling threats came not from the massive Panthers or Tigers, but from something far smaller, a single German soldier hidden in a hedgerow, cellar, or ditch, armed with a cheap, disposable anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust. It required almost no training, fired in an instant, and could destroy a Sherman with terrifying ease. For U.S. troops, it became a constant, invisible danger, the kind that could end a tank crew's life without warning. The Panzerfaust wasn't a complex device. It was basically a metal tube with a shaped charge warhead, designed to penetrate armor through sheer explosive force rather than velocity. Its simplicity made it deadly. Any soldier, even a teenager or a conscript with only a few days of instruction, could use it effectively. In the final years of the war, when experienced German tank crews were dwindling, the Panzerfaust transformed ordinary infantry into capable tank killers. American troops encountered these weapons most often in the hedgerows. A Sherman would approach a gap cautiously, turret scanning for movement. The crew might feel reasonably secure, believing the nearest German armor was miles away, but a Panzerfaust operator needed only a second's opportunity. Hidden behind thick vegetation, he would wait until the tank's vulnerable flank or rear came into view. Then a streak of flame, a violent impact, and the tank was either burning or disabled. Survivors spoke of the sickening thump, the interior filling with smoke, the sudden blast of heat that hit like a punch. What made the threat so demoralizing was how hard it was to detect. German soldiers using Panzerfausts were trained to engage at extremely close range, sometimes as near as 30 feet. They often positioned themselves in small pits, behind barn doors, or inside ruined houses where American armor had no chance of spotting them. Many tank commanders described the same experience. One moment of silence, the next moment flames erupting from their hull. German units organized Panzerfaust ambushes with chilling efficiency. Small teams of 2 or 3 soldiers moved independently, slipping between cover with their weapons tucked under coats until the right moment. Some positioned themselves behind disabled vehicles, using wrecks as bait. Others lay flat in ditches while American infantry passed directly above them, rising only when a tank followed. Even retreating German forces left behind isolated Panzerfaust teams specifically to slow American pursuits. American infantry quickly learned that advancing with tanks required constant vigilance. They swept every hedgerow corner, checked every window, and fired into likely hiding spots before calling armor forward. But even with precautions, the threat remained unpredictable. A single German hiding in a haystack or rubble pile could force an entire column to halt, reshuffle, or change direction. The psychological toll was significant. Sherman crews joked grimly that the Panzerfaust was the equalizer because it made every German soldier, no matter how inexperienced, capable of killing a tank. The danger intensified in towns and villages. Panzerfaust operators fired from upper floors, basements, and alleyway shadows. American after-action reports noted that in urban fighting, a tank was safe only when it wasn't moving, and even then, only marginally. Crews buttoned up their hatches, limiting visibility, fully aware that any exposed commander risked a sniper's bullet before the tank ever faced a Panzerfaust. As the war progressed, the Panzerfaust appeared in greater numbers. Germany produced millions. Even poorly supplied Volksgrenadier units carried them in abundance. American troops often found discarded tubes everywhere after clearing a position, reminders of how many shots might have been fired. What set Panzerfaust teams apart from other threats wasn't their sophistication. It was the feeling that the danger could come from anywhere, from a child soldier, a veteran sniper, a conscript farmer, or a wounded man crawling out of a cellar. It was a weapon that democratized destruction, turning hidden corners and silent fields into lethal zones. And, for U.S. soldiers pushing across Europe, that uncertainty, that inability to ever feel safe from what they couldn't see, became one of the defining fears of the campaign. For many American soldiers in France, the most unnerving part of facing the German army wasn't what they saw, it was what they didn't. Time and again, U.S. units found themselves taking fire from positions they had inspected moments earlier, positions that looked empty, quiet, harmless. Only later did they realize they had been staring directly at well-constructed German fighting positions that blended almost perfectly into the landscape. Camouflage wasn't simply a skill for the Wehrmacht, it was a practiced art, honed through years of war and applied with ruthless effectiveness on every front. German infantry took concealment seriously. Machine gun nests were dug into hedgerows so deeply that only a thin slit offered a view of the battlefield. Branches, sod, and brush were arranged with meticulous attention. A soldier walking past might see nothing but leaves. Meanwhile, behind that curtain, a fully crewed MG-42 waited with absolute stillness. Entire American squads moved within yards of these positions without realizing they were under observation until the first burst ripped out. The Germans also mastered the use of natural terrain. In forests, they positioned riflemen behind fallen logs, at the base of tree trunks, or beneath shallow pits covered in moss. In cities, they hid in collapsed stairwells, shell-blasted corners, or behind broken furniture arranged to disguise their silhouettes. Panzerfaust operators fired from second-story windows, then dropped down to cellars before American troops could pinpoint their location. To U.S. soldiers accustomed to more straightforward engagements, this level of concealment felt almost unfair. American tank crews quickly learned how effective German camouflage could be. They advanced cautiously along roads bordered by hedgerows that seemed quiet and unoccupied, until an invisible 75mm gun fired from a firing slit no wider than a man's hand. The Germans were experts at hull-down tank positions, often parking Panthers or Stugs behind small rises so that only the gun barrel protruded. Crews painted their vehicles with irregular patterns of greens, browns, and yellows, blending them seamlessly into the French countryside. Many American tankers reported only seeing the flash of the enemy's muzzle, never the tank itself. German deception extended far beyond camouflage. They used feints and decoys to mislead American units. A single machine gun might fire sporadically from a distant barn, drawing U.S. forces toward it only for the real ambush to erupt from the hedgerow on the opposite side. Sometimes Germans arranged logs, tires, or metal scraps to mimic armoured vehicles at a distance. American artillery wasted shells on what turned out to be elaborate fakes. Meanwhile, the real German armour lay concealed, waiting to strike. Snipers used deception with deadly precision. They placed dummy helmets on sticks to lure American shooters, marked likely firing lanes with rocks or branches, and fired only when absolutely certain of a kill. They changed positions constantly, slipping in and out of carefully prepared hides. The psychological impact was enormous. American patrols often reported being pinned by a single sniper they could not locate, despite hours of searching. Even retreating German units used deception to slow American advances. They left behind booby-trapped helmets, grenades buried under corpses, and tripwires set across doorways. Engineers found explosives hidden in wells, stoves, and fence posts. Every abandoned farmstead became a potential trap. Every quiet road held the possibility of a concealed minefield, marked with signs only the Germans understood. The cumulative effect of German camouflage and deception was simple but devastating. American troops lost confidence in what their eyes told them. A still hedgerow might conceal a full squad. A silent barn might hold a machine gun. A corpse might detonate. The Germans turned the battlefield into a place of constant suspicion, where every shape, shadow, and silence could be lethal. Facing a visible enemy is one thing. Facing an enemy you cannot find one who watches you while remaining unseen is something entirely different. And for U.S. soldiers pushing deeper into Europe, that lingering uncertainty added a level of fear that no amount of training could easily erase. American troops expected the Germans to defend their positions stubbornly, clinging to every trench, ditch, and farmhouse until the last bullet was spent. What they encountered instead was a system far more sophisticated, a method of defense built not on rigidity, but on calculated movement. The Germans called it elastic defense, and to U.S. soldiers facing it for the first time, it felt like fighting an enemy who refused to stay where he was supposed to. Elastic defense worked on a simple principle. Never let the attacker hit the real line first. German units placed forward outposts designed not to win, but to delay and disrupt. These outposts fired enough shots to force American units to deploy, take cover, and begin maneuvering, all while the main German positions remained hidden farther back, untouched and waiting. When the Americans pushed forward in force, The forward elements withdrew smoothly, falling back through narrow lanes or pre-dug escape routes that U.S. troops usually didn't spot in time. The result was disorienting. American infantry thought they had forced a retreat, only to walk directly into carefully prepared kill zones. German machine gun teams positioned farther behind the line opened fire just as the Americans emerged from cover. Mortars already dialed in began dropping shells along predictable approach routes. Snipers engaged from angles that forward units had intentionally left uncovered. What looked like a cracked line was actually part of a larger, layered design. American commanders soon realized this wasn't improvisation, it was doctrine. German manuals stressed flexibility, counterattacks, and the deliberate use of terrain. Defensive positions weren't static. They were webs woven through forests, villages, and hedgerows. The Germans studied the ground in detail, identifying every fold, ditch, and rise that could slow an enemy advance or conceal a fallback point. In practice, this meant the Americans rarely destroyed German positions outright. They displaced them only for those same German forces to reappear a few hundred yards back, reinforced and ready to fight again. U.S. troops reported the unsettling feeling of fighting the same enemy twice, sometimes 3 times, in the span of a single afternoon. A key part of elastic defense was the counterattack. When American forces broke through a section of the line, the Germans didn't panic. Instead, they let the attackers advance just far enough to become disorganized, stretched thin, and uncertain of the terrain. Then, with precision timing, small German groups launched sharp, violent counterattacks, aimed not at retaking all the ground, but at disrupting and confusing the Americans. These counterblows often hit from the flanks, where the terrain gave the advantage to the defender. American after-action reports frequently noted how German counterattacks seemed to appear out of nowhere. In reality, they were rehearsed. German NCOs were trained to lead these movements without waiting for higher orders. Reserve squads waited behind the lines specifically for this purpose. Mortar teams pre-registered their fire on likely routes of American advance. When the time came, everything moved quickly faster than many U.S. units expected. In the hedgerows, elastic defense became even more dangerous. Each hedgerow was a defensive line, fall back one, and the Germans still had dozens behind them. American troops spent days, sometimes weeks, grinding forward yard by yard, while German units bled them from distance, then disappeared into the next line. The psychological impact of elastic defense was profound. There was no moment of clarity where Americans knew they had broken the enemy. No decisive push that signaled victory in a sector. Every advance felt provisional, temporary, overshadowed by the knowledge that the Germans would return the moment the Americans relaxed their guard. U.S. soldiers learned the hard way that the German army did not defend by standing still. It defended by shaping the battlefield, absorbing pressure, and striking back on its own terms. And that made every step forward feel like walking into an enemy's plan, rather than forcing him into yours. American soldiers often spoke about the chilling precision with which German units placed their weapons, chose their firing angles, and selected their fallback lines. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't instinct. It was the product of a mindset drilled into German officers and NCOs, a way of thinking that treated every battlefield like a problem to be solved with mathematics, terrain analysis, and calculated timing. U.S. troops eventually gave it a name, the battlefield calculator. German junior leaders were trained not just to follow orders, but to analyze the ground in front of them, like engineers. Before a shot was fired, they studied distances, elevation, lines of sight, and natural choke points. A small rise in the earth wasn't simply cover, it was a natural firing platform. A bend in a road wasn't just a turn, it was a potential ambush point. A hedgerow wasn't an obstacle, it was a ready-made fortress. This analytical approach meant that German units entered engagements with an intimate understanding of how to exploit every inch of ground. American patrols often walked into these calculated traps. A single machine gun might be positioned to cover the most obvious approach, but a second, unseen position angled its fire to catch flanking attempts. Riflemen covered dead ground that Americans assumed was safe. Mortar crews placed themselves to hit predictable rally points. The precision was so refined that U.S. soldiers later recalled it felt like the Germans had predicted their exact movements, as if the battlefield had been designed specifically for them to fail. German officers were also trained to anticipate American reactions. They knew how long it would take for U.S. artillery to respond. They knew where American troops would naturally bunch up when under fire. They understood the tendencies of American armor, its hesitation in close terrain, its reliance on infantry spotting, its need for open lines of communication. German units used this knowledge to craft engagements that maximized American vulnerability. Nothing was improvised. Everything was deliberate. A key element of the battlefield calculator mindset was fire discipline. German troops rarely wasted ammunition on speculative shots. They waited for clean targets, firing with precision that reflected hours of drill and combat experience. Machine gun bursts were measured. Riflemen picked shots that pinned U.S. soldiers at the worst possible moments. Mortars targeted intersections, hedgerow breaches, and any terrain feature where movement slowed. American soldiers quickly learned that exposing even a helmet for too long could invite immediate, accurate fire. Another unsettling feature was the timing of German counteractions. The Germans seemed to understand when an American unit was most vulnerable after breaking through a hedgerow, after clearing a farmhouse, after pushing across a field. These were moments when formations loosened, when soldiers felt a brief sense of progress. That was when the Germans struck. Small counterattacks, perfectly timed, often threw U.S. units into disorder. Even when the Americans ultimately held their ground, the psychological impact of these sudden blows lingered. This analytical approach extended to German withdrawal plans. Retiring from a position wasn't retreat, it was a carefully planned maneuver that set the stage for the next defensive line. Germans rarely fell back chaotically. They moved to pre-selected positions that protected flanks, enabled overlapping fire, and forced the Americans to restart the exhausting process of clearing ground. To U.S. soldiers, it felt like being led deeper and deeper into a maze built by someone who already knew the exit. The battlefield calculator mindset wasn't about brilliance. It was about discipline, training, and experience. But to American troops encountering it for the first time, it created the impression of an enemy who could see the battlefield from above, who solved tactical problems faster than they could react. It reinforced a sobering truth. The Germans didn't just fight hard, they fought smart. And that intelligence made every engagement feel like a test the Americans had to pass or pay for in blood. Before many American units even caught sight of German soldiers, they encountered something far more insidious terrain that had been quietly, methodically transformed into a hidden killing ground. Fields that looked calm, crossroads that seemed safe, and trails that appeared well-traveled were often laced with mines placed by German engineers who understood exactly how to slow, maim, and psychologically weaken an advancing army. For U.S. troops, mines were not just a physical danger. They became a constant mental weight, a silent reminder that death could sit inches beneath their boots. The Germans were not careless with their mine placement. They approached mining with the same battlefield calculation that characterized their broader defensive strategy. Anti-tank mines were buried at depths so precise that only the pressure of a multi-ton vehicle would trigger them. Anti-personnel mines were hidden beneath leaves, shallow soil, or the floorboards of abandoned barns. Some were wired to trip lines, stretched across doorways, or concealed between fence posts. Others were placed along likely retreat paths, rather than advance routes, a detail that caught many American units off guard during counterattacks. The most common anti-personnel mine was the S-mine, known to American troops as the Bouncing Betty. Activated by pressure or a tripwire, it launched into the air before detonating at waist height, spraying steel ball bearings in a lethal radius. Soldiers who survived Betty blasts often carried shrapnel for the rest of their lives. Those who didn't were killed instantly. The psychological impact was disproportionate to the size of the weapon. Even seasoned units slowed their pace when rumors of S-mines circulated, scanning the ground obsessively with every step. Then there were the telemines, heavy, powerful charges designed to cripple tanks. To American crews, the worst part was not the explosion itself, but the knowledge that a minefield meant their vehicle could be immobilized, leaving them sitting ducks for Panzerfaust teams or anti-tank guns. Many tankers described the dread of hearing a metallic clunk beneath their tracks, a moment of frozen silence before they realized it was just a rock or debris, not a pressure plate. The fear alone slowed operations. The Germans often used mines in combination with other defenses. A small burst of rifle fire from a hedgerow might drive American troops toward a ditch laced with mines. Mortar fire would strike positions where the Germans knew U.S. soldiers would instinctively seek cover locations they had pre-mined days earlier. Some minefields were deliberately left partially open, creating safe corridors that funneled American units into kill zones covered by machine guns or snipers. Engineers suffered some of the worst casualties. Clearing mines meant crawling forward with prodding rods, listening for clicks, and working under the threat of hidden tripwires or booby-trapped corpses. German defenders targeted engineers immediately, understanding that without them, entire American formations would halt. Many engineer units worked for hours under intermittent fire, sweating in their helmets as they probed inch by inch through fields that offered no guarantees. To make matters worse, Germans frequently laid dummy mines, harmless objects buried just deeply enough to be discovered. These slowed American advances dramatically, as units called for engineers to clear paths that were, in reality, safe. The time wasted allowed German forces to reposition, reinforce, or withdraw. The tactical effectiveness was brutal. Even a fake minefield could delay a battalion for half a day. For U.S. soldiers, minefields changed the nature of movement. Advancing no longer meant simply watching the tree line or scanning for muzzle flashes. It meant studying the ground with the same intensity they gave to enemy positions. A patch of disturbed soil, an exposed root, a piece of wire barely visible in the grass, any of these could signal death. The stress accumulated. Men grew tense, jumpy, exhausted before battle even began. And that was the true power of German mines. Not just the wounds they inflicted, but the hesitation they created. The knowledge that every step, every footfall, every path might be the one that ended everything. It wasn't just the guns or the tanks that made American troops fear the German army. It was the ground itself, the silent, deadly ground the Germans had prepared long before the Americans arrived. American troops quickly discovered that darkness, which they hoped might level the playing field or conceal their movements, often worked in favor of the German army. To the Wehrmacht, night was not an obstacle. It was an opportunity, a time when experience, discipline, and training could overwhelm an enemy still learning how to navigate a battlefield without light. For U.S. soldiers, the first encounters with German night operations were sobering lessons in how vulnerable an army could become once the sun went down. Many German units, especially those hardened on the Eastern Front, trained extensively for nighttime operations. They practiced silent movement, low-light navigation, and coordinated attacks under conditions that would paralyze less disciplined forces. Across Russia's wide plains and the forests around Leningrad, German infantry had learned how to stalk, listen, and strike with minimal visibility. By the time American forces arrived in Europe, these nighttime habits were second nature. The most immediate advantage came from noise discipline. At night, German soldiers moved in near silence. They communicated not with shouts but with taps, gestures, and brief whispers. American pickets often reported hearing rustling, faint steps, or the soft clink of equipment long before they saw anything. And just as often, those sounds vanished. Some units described the unnerving sensation of hearing Germans shift positions all around them, as though an unseen enemy was tightening a ring in the darkness. German patrols used the terrain masterfully. They approached American lines from gullies, creek beds, and low ground that muffled their movements. They crawled over hedgerows in complete silence, positioning themselves just yards from U.S. foxholes without being detected. In several documented cases, German scouts slipped past entire American companies, gathering intelligence before disappearing back into the night. Ambushes were timed with precision. German units often waited until American troops moved, knowing that footsteps, clanking gear, or quiet conversations would give away their positions. A burst of MG-42 fire or a sudden grenade attack in the dark could throw an entire platoon into confusion. Without clear lines of sight, American units struggled to regain order. Officers shouted commands that blurred together. Men fired blindly at shadows. The Germans, meanwhile, fired short, deliberate bursts, then shifted position before the Americans could locate them. Mortar teams added to the chaos. German spotters, trained to read sound and silhouette in low light, called in fire missions with surprising accuracy. U.S. soldiers described the fear of hearing the faint thump of a mortar in the dark, knowing the next explosion could land anywhere, perhaps on a foxhole, perhaps on a group of men simply trying to huddle for warmth. German night raids also targeted supply lines and rear areas. Ammunition carriers, medics, and cooks found themselves under sudden attack from small, aggressive squads probing behind the lines. These strikes weren't designed to capture territory. They were meant to sow confusion, inflict quick casualties, and remind the Americans that nowhere was truly safe after sundown. One of the most unsettling tactics was the German habit of slipping into American positions and withdrawing before dawn. Troops awoke to find missing equipment, cut phone wires, or footprints weaving between foxholes. Some discovered that German scouts had been within arm's reach while they slept. This revelation spread rapidly through units already tense from long days of combat. Fatigue magnified everything. American soldiers, exhausted from daytime fighting, often dreaded nighttime more than any artillery barrage. Darkness forced them into a state of hyper-awareness. Every twig snap felt like a patrol closing in. Every gust of wind seemed like an approaching footstep. Sleep became shallow, irregular, and haunted by the fear that a German squad might be watching them from 15 yards away. The fear was justified. German night fighters weren't ghosts or legends. They were well-trained soldiers who understood how to manipulate the battlefield when visibility vanished. Their confidence in the dark created an imbalance that American units recognized and struggled to match in the first months of combat. For those US troops, facing the Germans at night wasn't just dangerous, it was a reminder that the enemy excelled in conditions where they felt blind, anxious, and alone. A reminder that the darkness belonged to the Wehrmacht. By the time American forces had been in combat long enough to recognize the patterns of German tactics, weapons, and discipline, a deeper truth emerged, something harder to quantify than machine gun fire, sniper accuracy, or armored superiority. The Germans carried with them a psychological edge, a reputation built not just on what they did, but how they did it. It was an intimidation factor that seeped into American units even before the first shots were fired, shaping expectations and influencing morale in ways that few commanders openly admitted, but many soldiers felt in their bones. Part of this edge was rooted in Germany's early wartime record. By 1944, German troops had already fought through Poland, France, the Balkans, and massive campaigns in the Soviet Union. That history preceded them. American soldiers knew they were facing an army that had survived some of the most brutal fighting in modern history. Even if many German veterans had fallen by the time the Americans arrived, the institutional memory, the training, the habits, the doctrine remained. This knowledge alone weighed on new U.S. replacements who were stepping onto the European continent for the first time. The Germans also projected confidence under fire. American infantrymen repeatedly noted that German units rarely appeared rattled. Even during artillery barrages, enemy soldiers moved deliberately, shifting positions with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. When a flank collapsed or communication lines failed, German NCOs stepped forward without hesitation, stabilizing the situation with minimal noise or visible panic. To the Americans, who were still gaining cohesion and experience, This composure made the Germans seem tougher than human, a perception that only fed the psychological imbalance. The distinctive sounds of German weapons played their part as well. The ripping buzz of the MG42, the heavy crack of the 88mm gun, the sudden thump of mortars firing from hidden positions, each became a sonic signature of fear. These sounds created instant reactions in American troops, forcing them to seek cover instinctively. German officers understood this psychological effect and used it to control U.S. movement. A single MG42 burst could freeze a platoon for precious seconds. A sudden artillery ranging shot could scatter an advance even before the main barrage began. Rumours amplified everything. Men coming from the front brought stories, some true, some exaggerated, of German brutality, night raids, hidden snipers, and tanks that seemed invincible. These stories circulated rapidly through replacements, waiting offshore or in staging areas. An enemy's reputation often arrives long before the enemy itself, and in this case, the Wehrmacht's reputation was intimidating enough to shape the mindset of troops who had yet to fire a shot. But perhaps the deepest source of the German psychological edge was their unpredictability. Troops never quite knew what to expect. A village might appear abandoned, only to erupt in coordinated fire from hidden positions. A retreating enemy might suddenly counterattack. A quiet night could turn violent without warning. This sense of uncertainty, of facing an opponent who always seemed capable of something new, wore on American nerves more than any single weapon or tactic. German discipline contributed to this unpredictability. Their infantry often fought with a unity of purpose that made small units appear stronger than they were. Their withdrawals were controlled, not desperate. Their counterattacks were sharp and well-timed. They rarely surrendered early in a fight. For Americans still building confidence and learning to trust their own training, this unwavering resistance created the impression of an enemy who was not only skilled, but endlessly determined. The cumulative psychological effect was significant. U.S. soldiers found themselves approaching each battle with heightened tension. Every rustling branch could hide an ambush. Every sudden silence could signal a trap. The Germans didn't just fight the Americans physically, they fought them mentally, shaping the emotional landscape of every engagement. And while American forces improved, rapidly gaining experience, confidence, and tactical understanding, the early months of combat were marked by a profound realization. Facing the German army was as much a psychological trial as a tactical one. It wasn't only the enemy's weapons that instilled fear, it was the knowledge that the men behind those weapons carried decades of warfare in their bones, and fought with a precision that made every battle feel like a contest of will as much as a fight for ground. When American forces broke through the beaches of Normandy, many believed the hardest part was behind them. The landing had been costly, chaotic, and brutal, but the interior of France in their minds promised open ground, maneuver warfare, and rapid breakthroughs. Instead, what awaited them was a grinding, claustrophobic struggle that bled divisions dry, one hedgerow at a time. Normandy was not a single battle. It was a slow, relentless attrition that introduced U.S. troops to the full weight of the German defensive machine. The first shock was the terrain. Hedgerows weren't fences or lines of shrubbery. They were ancient earth embankments, sometimes centuries old, covered in roots as thick as tree limbs and vegetation dense enough to hide a full squad. Each hedgerow formed a natural fortification. The countryside was a patchwork of these green walls, enclosing small fields that became individual battle zones. Advancing meant crossing into one field at a time, fighting, clearing it, and then starting all over again for the next. Every one of them felt like approaching a new enemy bunker. The Germans exploited this terrain with ruthless efficiency. They dug firing slits into the hedgerows, camouflaged machine gun nests, and placed snipers in positions that offered overlapping fields of fire. They pre-registered mortar zones on likely crossing points and set booby traps near gaps Americans would naturally use. The first field might be quiet, but the second could erupt in a coordinated wave of fire that pinned entire companies to the ground within seconds. American infantry quickly learned that the Germans rarely defended a field directly from the front. Instead, they positioned themselves diagonally, catching U.S. troops in deadly crossfire when they attempted to move forward. Even when Americans identified a firing position, the Germans often withdrew through narrow lanes, cut into the hedgerows, escape routes invisible to anyone who didn't already know they were there. By the time artillery or direct fire hit the nest, the defenders had already repositioned to the next line. Sherman tanks struggled just as much. Their high silhouettes made them easy targets for Panzerfausts lurking in hedgerow corners. Tanks couldn't simply smash through the embankments without exposing their bellies, a mistake German gunners were waiting for. Without infantry clearing ahead of them, Shermans became steel coffins. Without Sherman support, infantry lacked the firepower to suppress the machine guns and mortars pinning them down. This mutual dependence made even small advances complicated and costly. Artillery, one of America's greatest strengths, was difficult to use effectively. Dense hedgerows blocked lines of sight, prevented accurate spotting, and absorbed shrapnel that would have torn through open terrain. Many barrages fell short of their intended effect, leaving German defences bruised but intact. Meanwhile, German mortars lighter, faster to fire, and pre-sighted rained explosive shells onto American positions with terrifying precision. Every mile gained was paid for several times over. Companies that entered Normandy, strong and confident, emerged battered and hollowed out. Casualty lists grew. Replacements arrived with little time to integrate, stepping into units already stretched to breaking. The psychological toll mounted. Soldiers described the constant tension of not knowing whether the next hedgerow concealed an ambush, a sniper, or a machine gun crew waiting for a single misstep. The Germans fought with stubborn discipline, even when outnumbered. They counterattacked at dusk, exploited momentary lapses in American coordination, and held ground long enough to buy time for other units to regroup deeper inland. Every delay they created forced U.S. commanders to revise timelines, adjust objectives, and commit more resources than expected. Normandy was where American troops truly understood why the German army had earned its fearsome reputation. Not because the Germans were invincible, but because they knew how to turn every fold of earth, every patch of brush, every meter of ground into a battlefield shaped to their advantage. And in that suffocating landscape, the American advance moved not by miles, but by yards, each one carved out with sweat, blood, and the grim determination of men learning the hard way how formidable their enemy really was. Hill 112 looked ordinary on a map, a modest rise south of Cayenne, barely impressive to the eye. But to anyone who fought there, it became synonymous with relentless violence, grinding attrition, and the sobering realization that German armoured units, especially their Panthers, could dominate terrain even when outnumbered. For American and British troops, Hill 112 was a lesson in how a single piece of high ground, paired with German fire discipline and superior optics, could stall entire offensives and bleed units dry day after day. The hill offered the Germans two priceless advantages: elevation and visibility. From its crest, Panther crews had sweeping fields of fire across the surrounding countryside. Their long-barreled 75mm guns could reach out and hit Allied armour at distances where Shermans and Cromwells struggled even to identify the source of incoming fire. The Germans knew this, and they used Hill 112 as a fortress, built not of concrete, but of topography. For the Americans supporting British operations in the sector, the first encounters with Panther fire from the hill were unforgettable. Shermans advancing below suddenly erupted in flames as rounds penetrated their armour with alarming ease. Tank commanders reported that the Panthers fired as though they had all the time in the world, calm, measured shots that struck with astonishing consistency. Even when Allied artillery pounded the crest, the Panthers withdrew behind reverse slopes, waited out the barrage, and re-emerged the moment the shelling lifted. Infantry suffered equally. Advancing toward Hill 112 meant crossing open fields, shallow valleys, and hedgerow lines already pre-sighted by German machine gunners and mortars. The hill funneled American and British troops into narrow corridors where movement meant exposure, and exposure meant casualties. German observers perched in dugouts along the slope called in fire missions with rapid precision. Mortar shells burst among advancing units, and artillery struck assembly areas before attacks even began. It often felt as if the hill itself was watching, waiting for movement before unleashing another storm of steel. Panther crews on Hill 112 operated with veteran efficiency. Many had fought on the Eastern Front, where long-range tank duels and defensive warfare had honed their skills to razor sharpness. They knew when to fire, when to relocate, and when to hold fire to avoid revealing their position. American tank destroyer units found themselves outmatched by the Panther's superior optics. Even when M10s or 3-inch guns managed to get into range, they had to expose themselves first, giving the Germans the crucial first shot that often decided the outcome of any duel. The close terrain around the hill only worsened matters. German infantry, dug deep into foxholes reinforced with steel and timber, fought with stubborn tenacity. Whenever Allied units gained ground, German counterattacks, often supported by Panthers rolling down the slopes, slammed into them with devastating timing. Even when the Allies seized part of the hill, they rarely held it for long. The Germans treated Hill 112 as a hinge point of their defense, committing elite SS and Wehrmacht units to retake positions again and again. For the Americans observing or assisting these operations, the lesson was unmistakable. German armor, especially the Panther, could dominate a battlefield when terrain favored them, and Hill 112 favored them completely. After weeks of fighting, thousands of casualties, and countless armored losses, Hill 112 became a symbol of the grinding reality of combat in Normandy, a place where experience, discipline, and superior equipment turned a modest rise into a crucible of steel and fire. It was here that many American soldiers first admitted a sobering truth. Facing the German army wasn't just about courage, it required careful coordination, overwhelming firepower, and a willingness to endure losses against an enemy who knew how to turn every advantage into a weapon. Hill 112 showed the Allies what the Germans could do with high ground and Panthers, and it proved that even a small ridge could shape the fate of an entire campaign. By late July 1944, American forces in Normandy were exhausted from weeks of hedgerow combat. Every advance had been a fight for yards. Every field crossed had cost blood. Operation Cobra was designed to break that stalemate, a massive aerial bombardment followed by a concentrated ground assault intended to tear open the German defensive line once and for all. And while the operation ultimately succeeded, the battles in its opening days reminded U.S. troops why facing the German army demanded constant vigilance, even when momentum finally seemed to be shifting in their favor. When the bombers came, the earth shook. Thousands of tons of explosives crashed into German positions west of Saint-Lô, lifting dirt, smoke, and shattered equipment into the sky. Men who witnessed the bombardment described it as a thunder rolling across the ground. American planners believed the strike would annihilate German resistance. In many sectors, it did. But the survivors, veterans from the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of SS units, were not ordinary soldiers. They regrouped quickly, emerging from collapsed trenches and ruined orchards with weapons still in hand. Prepared to fight in terrain, the bombardment had turned into a moonscape. American infantry moved forward into the churned fields, expecting scattered resistance. Instead, they encountered pockets of German troops who fought with grim determination. Machine gun teams, dazed but intact, opened fire from crater rims. Mortar crews reassembled, equipment pulled from rubble. Snipers used bomb craters as cover, firing calmly at advancing Americans. The destruction of the terrain also slowed U.S. armor. Tanks struggled to crawl over uneven, cratered ground, creating gaps that German troops exploited. Despite the chaos, American breakthroughs began to form, but nothing came easily. As U.S. forces pushed deeper, German commanders unleashed counterattacks, designed not to retake ground, but to stall momentum. Small, mobile groups, often riding in half-tracks or supported by the few remaining Panthers, struck American flanks with startling speed. These counterattacks rarely lasted long, but they were sharp, violent, and timed to hit when American units were most disorganized from the advance. Infantry squads described hearing engines roaring in the distance, followed by bursts of MG-42 fire sweeping across open ground. German troops who had been hidden during the bombardment suddenly reappeared, launching assaults from angles that forced American companies to halt and reposition. Even when heavily outnumbered, these German forces acted with discipline and cohesion that surprised many US troops who expected shattered resistance. Panzerfaust teams became especially dangerous during Cobra. The broken terrain gave them countless places to hide. They let American tanks roll past them, then struck at armoured columns from the rear or flanks. Tank crews advancing without close infantry. Support learned quickly and catastrophically that the Germans still controlled the rhythm of the fight, even if the scale of the operation favoured the Americans. Perhaps the most sobering moment came when elements of Panzerlehr attempted a larger armoured counterattack despite their severe losses. Those tanks battered, outgunned, and few in number attacked with a determination that impressed even their adversaries. American anti-tank guns and air support eventually broke the assault, but not before it caused significant disruption and additional casualties. It was a reminder that the German army did not collapse easily. It resisted with whatever strength it had, even when logic said it shouldn't. Operation Cobra ultimately succeeded because of overwhelming air power, superior American logistics, and the sheer persistence of U.S. infantry and armour. But the German counterattacks in those crucial days left an impression on every soldier who faced them. The enemy did not simply retreat, he struck back again and again, unpredictably and fiercely, even from beneath the rubble of one of the largest bombardments of the war. For American troops, Cobra proved two truths: that they could finally break the German defensive line, and that even a shattered German unit could still fight with a ferocity that demanded respect, caution, and unyielding focus. The breakout had begun, but the enemy's will to resist had not yet broken. When American forces finally approached Germany's western border in the late autumn of 1944, many believed they were nearing the end of the war. France had been liberated. Belgium and Luxembourg were largely secured. German units were retreating across a wide front. But then the U.S. Army reached the edge of the Siegfried Line and immediately discovered that the enemy they had chased across Europe still possessed the ability to transform the terrain into a fortress. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, was not a single wall or trench. It was a vast network of bunkers, pillboxes, dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and interlocking defensive positions stretching hundreds of miles. Some sections were primitive, others modern and reinforced, but all shared one purpose: slow the enemy and bleed him. For American troops expecting rapid progress, the line became a brutal reminder that the Germans still had plenty of fight left. The first thing U.S. soldiers noticed were the dragon's teeth, rows of massive concrete pyramids arranged to halt tanks and funnel infantry into narrow kill zones. Behind these obstacles sat bunkers with thick concrete walls, firing slits barely wide enough for a rifle barrel. Machine guns inside these fortifications enjoyed overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach. Even a small number of defenders could dominate large stretches of ground. American engineers worked desperately to breach the obstacles, but the Germans had anticipated their every method. Minefields stretched out in front of the dragon's teeth, hidden under frost, grass, or shallow soil. Engineers clearing lanes often came under intense machine gun and mortar fire. Several units found themselves trapped in deadly funnels, forced into predictable paths that German gunners had pre-sighted months or even years earlier. German defenders inside the bunkers fought with a grim efficiency. Many were older reservists or convalescents, but the fortifications magnified their abilities. Machine gun teams fired from protected positions, confident that American small arms fire could not harm them. Mortar teams positioned behind the line dropped rounds with practiced accuracy onto U.S. infantry attempting to advance. At times, American units had to call in direct tank fire or flamethrower teams just to neutralize individual pillboxes, and even then, other nearby fortifications continued firing. The cold November weather compounded the struggle. Rain turned roads to mud, slowing tank support and cutting supply lines. Fog and low clouds hindered air support. German defenders, accustomed to the climate and familiar with the terrain, exploited every advantage. They launched small counterattacks at night, slipping through forests and ravines to hit American positions from unexpected angles. These assaults rarely aimed to retake ground. Instead, they disrupted American preparations and reminded frontline troops that the Germans were far from defeated. Infantry units described clearing bunker lines as some of the most exhausting combat of the entire war. Progress was measured bunker by bunker, trench by trench. Clearing one pillbox often meant immediately coming under fire from another. When American troops finally breached a position, they found the bunkers interconnected by underground passages, allowing defenders to retreat or launch counterattacks with alarming speed. The Siegfried Line also showcased the Germans' ability to use terrain as a force multiplier. Forests, slopes, and ravines shielded defensive positions and allowed German troops to move unseen. In several sectors, American units advanced for hours, believing they had achieved breakthroughs, only to stumble into secondary lines of fortifications just as deadly as the first. What made the Siegfried Line so psychologically taxing was its relentlessness. There was no clear front to break, no single objective whose capture would collapse the defense. Instead, every hill, bunker, and concrete blockhouse felt like another tooth in a monstrous jaw that refused to open. Even when American troops captured one section, it provided little comfort. They knew there were dozens more ahead. For many US soldiers, the Siegfried Line shattered the illusion that victory was just over the horizon. The Germans fought here with the determination of men defending their homeland, methodical, stubborn, and unyielding. And as the Americans pushed deeper into Germany's fortified border, they understood that the fear the Wehrmacht inspired wasn't just rooted in weapons or tactics. It came from facing an enemy capable of turning even concrete and earth into instruments of resistance, and doing so with ruthless precision. When American troops reached the outskirts of Aachen in October 1944, they knew they were about to enter a city of strategic importance, the first major German city the Allies would attempt to capture. What they didn't know was that Aachen would become one of the most brutal, claustrophobic, and psychologically exhausting battles they would face in the entire European campaign. Urban combat was a different kind of war, and the Germans defending Aachen turned the city into a labyrinth of danger where every wall, window, and doorway threatened death. The approach itself was punishing. Streets were narrow, bordered by stone buildings whose thick walls absorbed small arms fire and protected defenders from artillery blasts. Rubble choked intersections. German engineers had fortified key buildings with sandbags, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Every alley was a potential kill zone. Every courtyard held the possibility of a sniper or an anti-tank team waiting in the shadows. American units quickly learned that moving through Aachen required fighting room by room. Buildings were not simply obstacles, they were fortresses. German soldiers, many of them Volksgrenadiers and seasoned veterans, used the interiors to their advantage. They smashed holes in walls to create hidden passageways, allowing them to move between buildings without exposing themselves to American fire. They positioned machine guns on upper floors, firing down onto streets where US troops had little cover. Snipers operated from shattered attics, firing single, precise shots before disappearing into darkness. Tanks, which had been indispensable in open terrain, faced severe limitations in Aachen. The narrow streets restricted maneuver, leaving Shermans vulnerable to Panzerfaust strikes from basement windows or sniper fire that targeted exposed commanders. Tanks often had to coordinate closely with infantry, inching forward to blast entry points into fortified structures while riflemen stormed inside. Even then, German defenders frequently survived the blasts, emerging moments later to counterattack with grenades or automatic fire. One of the most unnerving aspects of Aachen was the constant sense of unseen enemy presence. German units moved underground through sewers and utility tunnels, reappearing behind American lines without warning. Entire squads vanished into basements during firefights, only to reappear hours later in different sectors. This maneuverability allowed the Germans to mount sudden local counterattacks that stalled American progress and forced units to secure buildings they thought were clear. Artillery and air support, normally decisive American advantages, were difficult to employ effectively. The risk of friendly fire in tight urban spaces meant U.S. forces had to rely more heavily on direct fire tank guns, bazookas, flamethrowers, and demolitions. Even when artillery was used, the Germans often sheltered in reinforced structures that survived the bombardments. American soldiers described the eerie experience of shells shaking buildings to their foundations, only to face German defenders emerging moments later, weapons ready. The fighting was intimate and relentless. Grenades, bayonets, and close-quarters gunfire dominated the battle. Platoons advanced through dark hallways, stairwells, and collapsed rooms, never certain what waited beyond the next corner. Many veterans later said urban combat stripped warfare down to its rawest form, a fight for inches, not yards. Civilians trapped inside the city added another layer of complexity. Their presence restricted the use of heavy firepower in some areas and created unpredictable situations as families fled burning homes or hid in cellars. The chaos blurred lines between combat zones and human suffering, adding emotional strain to soldiers already battling fatigue and confusion. German resistance was fierce. They fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, refusing to surrender buildings even when surrounded. Some units counterattacked repeatedly, despite having no realistic chance of pushing the Americans back. Others held strong points until they were completely encircled, forcing U.S. troops to clear them room by room under continuous fire. When Aachen finally fell after weeks of combat, the victory came at a high cost. The city lay in ruins. American units were battered, depleted, and emotionally drained. Many soldiers emerged from Aachen with the same conclusion. Urban warfare against the Germans was unlike anything they had faced. Aachen proved that the German army, even in retreat and facing overwhelming odds, could turn a city into a fortress and make every brick, every shadow, and every ruined doorway part of a defensive system that demanded courage, precision, and sacrifice from those who dared to enter. For U.S. troops, Aachen wasn't just another battle, it was a revelation. The enemy they feared could fight hardest not on open ground, but in the depths of their own cities, with every street becoming a battlefield and every building a final stand. For American soldiers who entered the Hurtgen Forest in late 1944, the war shifted from maneuver and firepower to something far more primitive and unforgiving. The towering pines, persistent fog, and sodden earth created an environment where visibility collapsed, navigation failed, and every step felt like walking into a trap designed by nature and perfected by the Wehrmacht. The Hurtgen wasn't a battlefield, it was a slow, grinding machine that chewed up battalions and returned silence in their place. The forest itself was the first enemy. Trees grew so densely that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Trails turned to mud under constant rain. Compass bearings became worthless as landmarks disappeared behind walls of identical trunks. Vehicles bogged down within minutes. Wounded men couldn't be carried easily. Communication lines snagged on branches, snapped, or vanished beneath fallen limbs. American units accustomed to coordinating across open terrain suddenly found themselves isolated, confused, and vulnerable. The Germans knew this terrain well. They had occupied it for months, carving dugouts into hillsides, reinforcing bunkers with logs and earth, and establishing interlocking fields of fire that blended seamlessly into the landscape. Their foxholes were deep, dry, and protected. American foxholes filled with icy water within hours. German observers climbed trees or used elevated positions to spot U.S. movement, while American units struggled to see more than a few yards ahead. Machine gun nests hid behind fallen logs, ready to unleash sudden, devastating bursts the moment an American squad revealed itself. Mortar teams were even more dangerous. Their positions were well concealed, pre-sighted, and nearly impossible to locate. U.S. infantry reported shells falling with uncanny precision, often targeting choke points such as ravines, narrow paths, or natural clearings. Each explosion tore through the trees, sending wood splinters flying like shrapnel, a horrifying effect that turned the forest into a death trap even without enemy bullets. Minefields were everywhere. Germans scattered S-mines along trails, buried telemines beneath patches of soft earth, and strung tripwires between trees where soldiers naturally placed their hands for balance. Engineers worked tirelessly, but even they struggled. Clearing a single path could take hours, and rain often concealed the signs they relied on. Many soldiers described the fear of walking through the Hurtgen as worse than any firefight because every step felt like it might be their last. German counterattacks were small but sharp. The enemy didn't need large formations in this terrain. Instead, squads of experienced troops moved silently through the fog, striking American positions at dawn or dusk, retreating before a coherent response could form. Their knowledge of the forest allowed them to appear and vanish without warning. Even when American units held their ground, the psychological cost accumulated. Supplies were another constant struggle. Trucks couldn't reach forward positions. Ammunition, rations, and medical gear had to be carried by hand along slippery, winding trails. Men went hungry. They shivered in soaked uniforms for days at a time. Trench foot spread. Fatigue became a weapon the Germans didn't need to fire. It spread naturally through every regiment that entered the trees. Wounded soldiers often lay where they fell. Evacuating them required teams of stretcher bearers who moved inches at a time over brutal terrain while under threat of sniper or mortar fire. Some men died not from their wounds, but from exposure, waiting for help that struggled through the forest's unforgiving maze. Worst of all, the battle seemed to have no clear purpose to the soldiers fighting it. There were no towns to liberate, no sweeping offensives to support, only the demand to push forward through an endless, blood-soaked forest. Morale suffered. Entire companies were worn down to handfuls of exhausted survivors. Reinforcements arrived already aware of the forest's reputation, carrying dread as heavy as their gear. By the time the battle dragged into winter, the Hurtgen had earned its grim nickname, the Death Factory, not because of dramatic charges or tank duels, but because it drained life slowly, relentlessly, through cold, fear, exhaustion, and the hidden lethality of the German defensive system. For American troops, the Hurtgen forest became the embodiment of why they feared the German army. Not because the Germans were everywhere, but because in that dark, suffocating place, the Germans didn't have to be. The forest itself fought for them. In December 1944, as snow settled over the dense forests of the Ardennes, many American units believed they had entered a period of relative quiet. The lines were thin, held by divisions recovering from months of fighting, or by green troops who had not yet experienced the brutality of sustained combat. The terrain seemed too rugged, too remote, too inhospitable for anything more than patrol skirmishes. Then, without warning, the German army launched its last great gamble, a massive winter counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. And for American troops caught in its opening blow, the shock was unlike anything they had faced before. The attack began before dawn, on December 16th. German artillery echoed through the snow-draped trees, rolling over American positions in a barrage that stunned units who had grown accustomed to sporadic fire. Communications were shattered instantly. Forward observers could barely see through the fog and snow. When the shelling lifted, the forest filled with the sound of engines, hundreds of them, as German armoured columns pushed hard through narrow roads that U.S. commanders had assumed were impassable in winter. Then came the infantry veteran Volksgrenadiers, paratroopers and SS units who advanced with a speed and determination that American troops did not expect so late in the war. They moved through the woods in white camouflage, appearing ghost-like through the snow. Machine guns opened up from angles Americans had not prepared for. Mortar shells landed among foxholes that only hours earlier had felt safe. Entire outposts were overrun before they even realized the scale of the assault. For many American units, the initial reaction was disbelief. Soldiers had heard rumors of collapsing German morale, dwindling supplies, and units operating with skeleton crews. But what they faced in the Ardennes was an enemy who fought with the desperation of men trying to change the course of the war in a single strike. The Germans attacked with the precision of an army that had planned every movement meticulously. They cut roads, overran command posts, captured crossroads, and isolated companies before they understood they were surrounded. The fog and storm clouds grounded Allied aircraft, one of the Americans' greatest advantages. Without air cover, German armour moved freely. Panzer columns smashed into thinly held lines, their Tigers and Panthers shrugging off fire from American tank destroyers. Roadblocks meant to slow them were swept aside. Villages fell in rapid succession. Some American units were forced to retreat in disorder. Others were completely encircled and captured. Stories of massacres at places like Normandy spread quickly, heightening the fear and uncertainty. Communication failures made the situation worse. Radio lines crackled with fragmented messages. Headquarters struggled to understand where the main blow was falling. Units ordered to hold, positions found themselves cut off within hours. Reinforcements driving toward the front ran into ambushes on icy roads, where German troops had already seized key junctions. Yet the psychological shock was just as profound as the physical one. Soldiers realized that the Germans were not collapsing. They were striking with ferocity and tactical brilliance, using terrain, weather, and surprise to maximum effect. The sight of disciplined German infantry moving through snow-covered forests, while American units scrambled to form defensive lines, left a deep impression on those who survived the first days. Still, amidst the chaos, American resistance began to stiffen. Small groups held crossroads against overwhelming odds. Engineers blew bridges to slow the advance. In towns like St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, determined defenders bought precious hours. Bastogne, surrounded and battered, refused to yield a decision that would later become symbolic of American resilience in the face of German firepower and aggression. But in those early days, before reinforcements arrived and the weather cleared enough for U.S. air power to return, the Ardennes offensive reminded American troops exactly why they had feared the German army. Because even at its weakest moment, the Wehrmacht could launch a blow so sudden, so coordinated, and so devastating that it shook the confidence of every soldier caught in its path. The Bulge was more than a battle. It was a shock, a return of an enemy the Americans thought they had already beaten, striking with one last terrifying surge of strength. In the frozen days of December 1944, the Belgian town of Bastogne became the center of a tightening noose, a ring of German forces pushing from every direction in the hopes of crushing the American defense and opening the road to the Meuse. What unfolded there was more than a siege. It was a brutal, frigid contest of endurance in which American troops, cut off and surrounded, faced not only a determined enemy but the full weight of winter's cruelty. And though the siege is remembered largely for defiance and resilience, the fear that permeated those woods and foxholes revealed just how formidable the German army remained. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, supported by tankers, artillery units, and remnants of shattered regiments retreating from the German offensive, arrived in Bastogne under chaotic conditions. They had little time to prepare defensive lines, even less time to replenish supplies, and no time at all to acclimate to the cold. Snow fell constantly, softening the edges of foxholes but hardening the misery within them. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and burlap sacks, trying to keep fingers from numbing, rifle bolts from icing, and boots from freezing to their feet. The Germans wasted no time tightening the ring. Their troops, many of them Volksgrenadiers, SS soldiers, and armoured elements, advanced through the forest with practiced efficiency. They cut roads, severed communication lines, and attacked outlying positions with aggressive probes meant to test the American perimeter. These early engagements were small but vicious. Automatic fire echoed through snow-covered trees. Mortar rounds thudded into frozen ground, sending shards of ice and dirt into foxholes. American patrols disappeared into white forests where Germans lay in wait under camouflage smocks. By December 20th, the encirclement was complete. Bastogne was surrounded. There was no way out, and no supplies coming in, at least not yet. Ammunition dwindled, food rations shrank, medical stations overflowed, cold injuries mounted. Yet the Germans pressed harder, attacking in multiple sectors to identify weak points. They positioned artillery on ridges and blasted American lines with relentless barrages. The sound of incoming rounds, already terrifying, grew even worse when frozen air carried the explosions farther and sharper across the battlefield. German tanks pushed toward Bastogne from several directions. Panthers and Mark IVs probed the outskirts, firing high-velocity shells into buildings and tree lines. Infantry followed close behind, advancing through snowdrifts, their winter uniforms blending almost perfectly into the landscape. Every attack felt deliberate, coordinated, and executed with the confidence of soldiers who had mastered winter warfare on the Eastern Front. American units repelled these assaults, but the cost was high, and the knowledge of how experienced their enemy was weighed heavily on the defenders. Then came the demand for surrender. The Germans sent messengers to Bastogne, carrying a formal ultimatum that promised total destruction if the Americans did not lay down their arms. The psychological tactic was clear: break morale, force capitulation, and secure a strategic victory without further bloodshed. When the famous reply of "nuts" was delivered, it boosted American resolve. But the reality remained. They were surrounded by an enemy fully capable of making good on its threat. The next days tested the defenders more severely. German units launched coordinated assaults at dawn and dusk, using fog and snowstorms to conceal their movements. Some breached the American perimeter, forcing brutal close-quarters fighting in the woods. Machine gun nests firing from frozen forests chewed through advancing German squads, but each attack left American units more depleted and exhausted. Supply drops eventually offered relief, but every crate parachuting into the snow reminded the defenders how precarious their situation was. German flak guns fired at the aircraft. Many supplies landed outside the perimeter, seized by prowling German patrols. The siege dragged on, with the cold biting deeper each night. Relief finally arrived when Patton's Third Army broke through on December 26th, but even then, the surrounding Germans did not scatter immediately. They fought stubbornly, retreating only when pressure mounted across the entire front. For the Americans emerging from their foxholes, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, the lesson of Bastogne was searingly clear. Even cut off, outnumbered, and facing starvation, the German army remained disciplined, aggressive, and unrelenting. Bastogne was a victory, but it revealed a truth that chilled American troops as sharply as the winter wind. The Germans could still strike fear, even when the entire world believed they were on the verge of collapse. By early 1945, American troops had pushed the German army back across Belgium and into the heart of the Reich. The Ardennes offensive had failed, the Siegfried Line had cracked, and yet, as the US Army advanced eastward, another obstacle rose before them, one every soldier knew held deep, strategic and symbolic weight: the Rhine River. Broad, cold, fast-moving, and heavily defended, it formed Germany's last natural fortress. Crossing it would mean breaking into the industrial core of the enemy's homeland. But the Germans understood this too, and they were determined to make the Americans pay dearly for every attempt to reach the far bank. For the U.S. troops approaching the Rhine, the landscape shifted dramatically. The forests thinned. Villages, though damaged, stood more densely. The roads widened and twisted toward major urban centres. German positions here were no improvised hedgerow defences or temporary strongpoints. These were prepared lines, manned by troops who knew the terrain intimately and were fighting to protect their own soil. The defenders included a mix of Wehrmacht veterans, Volksgrenadiers, Hitler Youth Auxiliaries, and ad hoc formations of police, sailors, and factory workers, a patchwork force, but one fueled by a sense of last resort desperation. The Germans transformed the West Bank into a labyrinth of fire and steel, artillery batteries hid in woods and factory yards. Anti-aircraft guns were repurposed as anti-tank defences, positioned to sweep roads where American armour would inevitably pass. Snipers holed up in church steeples, second-story windows, and rubble piles. Even as entire cities crumbled under bombardment, German resistance inside them remained fierce and unpredictable. American infantry pushing toward the Rhine encountered constant ambushes. German squads used the ruined urban terrain to maximum effect, firing, falling back, reappearing from cellars and side streets. Mortars, always the Germans' most reliable weapon, fired with unnerving accuracy into crossroads, assembly areas, and any exposed group of advancing soldiers. The closer U.S. troops came to the river, the more fanatically the Germans resisted. Then there were the bridges. American soldiers knew that every intact bridge over the Rhine was a potential lifeline into the heart of Germany, and the Germans knew it too. As U.S. units approached, they heard explosions echo across the river. One by one, German engineers detonated the spans, sending steel and concrete crashing into the water. The blasts lit the sky in orange arcs of flame, each detonation a reminder that the enemy was determined to deny them any easy crossing. When bridges remained standing, German forces defended them with the ferocity of men guarding the last door to their home. Machine gun nests lined the approaches. Tanks, supported by infantry, fired from concealed positions. Artillery zeroed in on every access road. Crossing attempts turned into deadly gauntlets of shrapnel, smoke, and collapsing masonry. Soldiers trying to advance through riverfront towns described the effort as walking into a funnel of fire. Even when the Americans finally reached the riverbank, the fight was far from over. The Rhine itself posed a terrifying challenge. Its currents were strong enough to overturn assault boats. The width made smoke cover difficult. German machine guns on the far bank swept the shoreline with relentless fire. Artillery pounded any assembly point where bridging equipment was staged. Engineers, always among the most vulnerable, suffered heavy casualties, laying pontoons, repairing blown spans, or ferrying soldiers under constant observation. Yet amidst this brutal resistance came a miracle. At Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge remained intact. When American forces discovered it still standing, they attacked with urgency, shock, and disbelief. The Germans threw everything they had at the bridge: artillery barrages, air attacks, demolition teams, but the Americans clung to it under fire, reinforcing the far bank and turning a narrow foothold into a strategic breakthrough. Still, Remagen was the exception, not the rule. Other crossings required night assaults, amphibious operations, and brutal fighting under machine gun fire. American soldiers crossing the Rhine described hearing rounds snap overhead, the river's spray mixing with smoke, and the cries of men struggling through icy water while searchlights probed for targets. When the US Army finally surged across in force, the psychological impact was enormous. The barrier that Germany had considered its last shield had been breached, but the Americans who made the crossing carried with them the memory of the resistance, the snipers, the artillery, the collapsing bridges, the desperate counterattacks, and the realization that even with defeat looming, the German army fought with a ferocity that made every mile costly. Crossing the Rhine was more than a strategic victory. It was proof that the enemy they had feared since Normandy would resist until the very last river, the very last town, the very last breath. By the spring of 1945, American forces advancing into Western Germany expected resistance to weaken as the Reich crumbled. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were shattered, and German formations were dissolving under constant pressure. Yet, when US Troops reached Cologne, one of Germany's largest and most symbolic cities. They discovered that urban warfare remained as deadly as ever. The city's destruction had not softened its defences, it had sharpened them. Every collapsed building, every shattered street, and every mound of rubble became a sniper's nest, a machine gun hide, or a concealed passageway for men determined to make the Americans fight for every block. The approach to Cologne was eerie. Smoke hung over the skyline in drifting sheets. Entire neighbourhoods were flattened, reduced to jagged outlines of brick and steel frames. Church spires jutted into the sky like broken fingers. Yet despite the devastation, or perhaps because of it, the city concealed defenders who used the terrain with lethal intelligence. German snipers, some of the best trained in the Wehrmacht, occupied high vantage points, using holes blown through upper floors to fire on American patrols below. They moved between firing positions through destroyed rooftops and interior walls, avoiding open streets and minimizing exposure. American infantry reported the unsettling sensation of being watched long before any shot rang out. One patrol entered a quiet intersection only to have a single rifle shot drop the point man instantly. The shooter never revealed himself twice in the same place. Another squad came under fire from what appeared to be an empty church bell tower. The sniper slipped out before tanks could return fire. These engagements weren't random. They were deliberate, precise, and meant to slow the advance by instilling fear with each measured bullet. Machine gun crews added to the danger. They positioned themselves deep inside collapsed factories, where the narrow windows and dark interiors masked muzzle flashes. Their guns swept streets littered with debris, forcing American units to maneuver house to house rather than risk open exposure. Moving even 10 yards required coordination and covering fire. Soldiers described the city as a maze, where every corridor opened into a kill zone. Then there was the armor. The famous footage of the duel between an American Pershing tank and a German Panther in central Cologne captured only a glimpse of the threat. German tanks, often down to their last fuel and ammunition, fought with desperate cunning. A Panther might wait motionless behind rubble until an American tank turned a corner. The first shot, if well placed, could disable or kill before the Americans even saw their attacker. For tank crews, Cologne was a reminder that the German armoured threat had not vanished simply because the war was nearing its end. Even more unsettling were the irregular fighters, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, and local police who joined the defence. Teenagers armed with Panzerfausts hid in basements, garages, and sewer openings. Older men fired from shattered doorways with surprising accuracy. Their lack of formal training didn't matter in a ruined city where ambushes required little more than courage, concealment, and one decisive moment. These irregulars created unpredictability, forcing American troops to treat every civilian structure as a potential strongpoint. Urban infiltration tactics also persisted. At night, small German squads slipped across American lines through the rubble, attacking isolated positions or attempting to sabotage supply points. The sound of shifting stones or glass crunching under boots often preceded sudden close-quarters firefights in the dark. Even as the German army collapsed elsewhere, Cologne's ruins allowed defenders to prolong the fight far longer than American planners expected. Artillery and air support remained difficult to use effectively. Shelling risked triggering secondary collapses that could bury entire companies. Airstrikes often created even more debris that blocked armoured movement. In many sectors, American forces relied on combined infantry and armour teams moving slowly, clearing each building meticulously with grenades, rifles, flamethrowers, and demolition charges. When Cologne finally fell, the resistance did not end with a dramatic last stand. It faded through one final sniper shot, one last hidden mine, one final burst of machine gun fire from a collapsed brewery. The fighting simply thinned until silence, real silence, settled over the city. For the Americans who fought there, Cologne represented a sobering truth. Even in defeat, the German army could transform a ruined city into a battlefield that demanded every ounce of skill, caution, and endurance. It was a reminder that the fear they carried was never just of weapons or tactics, but of an enemy who refused to stop fighting, even when the war itself was already slipping away. As American forces pushed deeper into the industrial heartland of Germany in the spring of 1945, they found themselves encircling the Ruhr, the region that had fueled the German war machine for decades. Hitler had declared it would never fall. Factories would continue forging steel and munitions. Workers would form militias. Wehrmacht units would hold the line. But when U.S. forces finally closed the ring, the Ruhr pocket became something different. A sprawling, chaotic battleground where German troops cornered, desperate, and fractured fought with a mix of stubborn professionalism and unpredictable fury. At first glance, the Ruhr seemed broken. Smoke poured from bombed-out chimneys. Rail yards were tangled with the wreckage of locomotives. Blast furnaces lay silent, towering over empty streets. Yet within that industrial ruin, the Germans had built a maze of defences. Machine gun positions were dug beneath conveyor frames and boiler rooms. Snipers perched in crane towers high above the rubble. Entire factories were converted into strongpoints, their reinforced walls capable of withstanding tank fire, far better than the houses of Aachen or Cologne. American troops advancing into these industrial zones encountered fierce resistance. German units, a mix of regular Wehrmacht, SS remnants, Volkssturm, and factory workers pressed into service, fought from behind conveyor belts, steel presses, turbine housings, and the skeletons of half-finished locomotives. Gunfire echoed through the cavernous interiors, ricocheting unpredictably off metal beams and machinery. At times, visibility dropped to a few feet, as dust and smoke from recent bombardments filled the massive halls. Factories weren't the only danger. Mines littered the ground around warehouses, rail lines, and storage yards. Germans buried explosives beneath piles of scrap metal, inside abandoned coal wagons, and along narrow corridors between storage tanks. Engineers, already tested in the Hurtgen and Siegfried line, found themselves crawling through toxic sludge and twisted rebar, clearing paths in places never meant to be battlefields. The Germans also executed a fighting withdrawal within the pocket, a series of small, sharp counterattacks designed not to regain lost ground but to disrupt American pressure. At night, squads moved through rail tunnels and storm drains, emerging behind American outposts with sudden bursts of gunfire. Trains, stripped of cargo and armoured with sandbags, were rolled down tracks as mobile firing platforms. In one notorious incident, German troops launched a dawn raid from a coal storage building, using the dense black dust to conceal their approach until they were nearly atop American lines. American patrols quickly learned that every building had multiple floors, sublevels, and hidden rooms that could conceal German defenders. Clearing operations became slow, methodical, and exhausting. Grenades bounced unpredictably off machinery. Bullets sparked against heavy steel. Many firefights took place in near darkness, the only illumination coming from flickering flames or shattered skylights. Psychologically, the pocket weighed heavily. Unlike previous battles where the direction of the front was clear, the Ruhr contained chaos. Enemy pockets appeared behind American lines, some holding out for days. Prisoners spoke of no unified command, only local officers urging their men to fight on for the fatherland. Others surrendered in groups of dozens or even hundreds, exhausted and starving, emerging from bunkers clutching rifles that had long since run out of ammunition. This unpredictability made the fighting unnerving, a mixture of desperate resistance and sudden collapse. For tank crews, the Ruhr was especially hazardous. The narrow industrial streets were cluttered with wreckage, collapsed piping, and rail cars that forced Shermans into predictable paths. German Panzerfaust teams hid beneath loading platforms or behind mountains of slag. Tanks advancing through factory yards often found themselves ambushed from above, German troops firing downward from catwalks or crane platforms where American units struggled to return fire effectively. Yet despite all this, the end was inevitable. As U.S. divisions tightened the encirclement, German supplies dwindled to nothing. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of rounds per man. Vehicles ran out of fuel. Medical supplies disappeared. Still, in pockets across the region, groups of German soldiers chose to fight until overrun. They launched local counterattacks with the same discipline and aggression that had defined the Wehrmacht earlier in the war, even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. When the Ruhr pocket finally dissolved its defenders, surrendering by the tens of thousands, American troops walked through miles of industrial wasteland and captured positions, shaken by the contrast. Some German units had fought with professional precision until their last bullet. Others had surrendered abruptly, their morale shattered. But the message, once again, was clear. Even surrounded, starving, and out of options, the German army still managed to turn an entire industrial region into a battlefield, one filled with traps, ambushes, and desperate stands that demanded caution and cost American lives until the final hour. The Ruhr showed that fear wasn't born from the enemy's strength alone. Sometimes it came from the simple knowledge that they would not stop fighting, even when stopping was the only rational choice left. As American divisions pressed deeper into Bavaria in April 1945, they approached a city whose name carried immense symbolic weight for the collapsing Reich, Nuremberg, the site of the Nazi Party's most grandiose rallies, the birthplace of its laws, and one of its ideological capitals. The city was expected to resist fiercely. And despite the German army's strategic collapse, the defenders of Nuremberg, a mixture of SS troops, Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm militias, Hitler Youth, and political fanatics, transformed the ruined city into a final stage where desperation and ideology fused into a terrifying kind of urban warfare. Even before the battle began, American soldiers saw the scale of destruction. Weeks of Allied bombing had reduced vast sections of Nuremberg to skeletal remains. Entire districts were charred black. Landmarks stood as hollowed monuments. But the rubble that symbolized collapse also provided world-class defensive terrain. Streets were clogged with debris that shielded machine gun teams. Collapsed buildings created natural bunkers. Underground cellars connected block to block, creating tunnel-like networks that allowed defenders to appear and vanish with alarming ease. American infantry advancing into the outskirts quickly realized they were facing not only trained units but also armed civilians, some barely older than boys who fought with reckless zeal. Hitler Youth squads, wearing mismatched uniforms and armed with Panzerfausts, launched furious ambushes from alleys and cellar entrances. They attacked at distances so close the blast risked killing them too. Their fanaticism unsettled even hardened veterans. These were not soldiers following orders. They were indoctrinated children fighting for an idea they had been taught since birth. SS units held the more strategic positions. They fired from fortified buildings, often decorated with tattered Nazi banners. Their machine gunners displayed disciplined fire patterns, forcing American units to move through side streets and smashed courtyards to avoid kill zones. Snipers used what remained of cathedral towers and civic buildings as perches, firing with unnerving accuracy at riflemen, tank commanders, and medics. Many snipers moved between floors using holes blasted through interior walls, making it nearly impossible to track their routes. German mortar teams added to the chaos. They operated from basements and sewer access points, launching shells that detonated unpredictably in the rubble-strewn streets. The sound of mortars echoing through the ruined city created a constant sense of tension. American squads never knew when the next round would land or whether the street they had just crossed was already targeted. Tanks faced their own nightmare. Panthers and Mark IVs, though few in number, were positioned in narrow avenues where they could fire at long range while remaining protected by heaps of debris. Panzerfaust teams lurked behind shattered, stone facades, waiting for an American Sherman to edge forward before unleashing a fatal shot. The confined terrain forced American armor to rely heavily on infantry to clear every step ahead, a process that slowed the advance to a crawl. Inside the city center, resistance stiffened further. Some German officers ordered their men to fight to the death. Others executed civilians, attempting to flee. The battle took on a chaotic rhythm. Sudden bursts of gunfire, followed by eerie silence. Rapid counterattacks launched from side streets. Isolated pockets of Germans barricaded inside buildings, adorned with Nazi symbols, refusing to surrender even as flames spread around them. Psychologically, The experience weighed heavily on the Americans. Fighting indoctrinated teenagers and aging Volkssturm volunteers felt different from fighting seasoned Wehrmacht troops. There was no predictability, no clear sense of when a position would collapse. Every doorway seemed to hide an ambush. Every shadow felt like a sniper's nest. And the defenders, even those inexperienced, fought with the desperation of people convinced the war's end heralded their annihilation. American commanders responded with overwhelming force. Artillery pounded strongpoints. Tanks blasted holes into buildings to create entry routes. Flamethrower teams cleared fortified basements. Block by block, the city was wrested from German control. Yet the defenders still launched nighttime harassment attacks, slipping through rubble to fire on American outposts before disappearing again. When Nuremberg finally fell, it was not with a grand last stand, but with a slow, bitter collapse. Isolated firing positions went silent one by one. SS flags were burned or hidden. Fanatical resistance flickered out in the ruins. But the cost was visible everywhere in the wrecked streets, in the stunned faces of captured youth soldiers, in the exhaustion etched into American units who had expected the German army to break cleanly, but instead found themselves fighting an enemy whose ideology compelled him to resist to the last brick. Nuremberg proved that even in its death throes, the Reich could turn its cities into nightmares, places where fanaticism, desperation, and ruined terrain combined to make every corner as dangerous as a battlefield's front line. By late April 1945, American forces advancing into southern Germany expected the fighting to taper off. Rumors circulated of collapsing German morale, mass surrenders, and units disappearing into the Alps. But when US troops approached Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi movement, and one of its last symbolic strongholds, they discovered that the city's defenders were prepared to turn its streets, plazas, and government buildings into one final, punishing battleground. If Berlin was the political heart of the Reich, Munich was its ideological seed, and many of those left to defend it fought with the fervour of men refusing to let that seed be torn from the ground. The outskirts were deceptively quiet at first. Wide boulevards lined with trees led toward the city centre. Suburban houses stood mostly intact, giving the sense of a place untouched by the full destruction of war. But this calm was misleading. German troops, SS, Wehrmacht stragglers, police battalions, and clusters of Hitler Youth had prepared hidden defences behind the facades. As American infantry pressed forward, machine gun fire erupted from upstairs windows. Snipers fired from garages and attic crawl spaces. Mortar shells fell from positions set deep within garden plots and behind low stone walls. Once inside the city proper, the real fight began. Munich's historic centre with its administrative buildings, old guild halls, and civic structures became a dense zone of ambushes. The Germans had studied the city's layout well. They positioned sharpshooters in the higher floors of the Rathaus, the Frauenkirche, and structures surrounding Marienplatz. From these elevated positions, they could fire down onto the streets with sweeping arcs of visibility. Every advancing squad risked being cut down by a single, unseen rifleman. American troops attempting to clear the City Hall district encountered fortified strongpoints that had been reinforced with sandbags and overturned furniture. In some cases, defenders had rewired electrical systems to create traps, electrified doors, rigged light fixtures, and booby-trapped stairwells. Clearing these structures required flamethrower teams, demolitions, squads, and point-blank firefights in narrow hallways where smoke, splintering wood, and shouted orders blurred together. Munich's industrial districts posed their own dangers. Factories with heavy machinery and metal catwalks provided perfect cover for German machine gun teams. Their fire echoed painfully in the cavernous spaces of old breweries and warehouses. US soldiers advancing through these areas described the uncanny sensation of hearing German boots clanging on upper-level platforms without knowing which direction the attack would come from. Panzerfaust teams stalked American tanks from behind boilers, conveyor systems, and storage tanks, waiting for just one exposed flank to fire. Then there were the fanatics. The Hitler Youth were out in force, some barely 15 years old, others even younger. Armed with Panzerfausts, pistols, and outdated rifles, they charged American positions with the recklessness of true believers. Their tactics were often suicidal, rushing out of alleyways at close range, firing Panzerfausts from behind burning cars, or attempting to climb onto American tanks to drop grenades inside open hatches. Many died instantly, but their presence rattled even battle-hardened U.S. veterans, who struggled to reconcile their duty with the brutal reality of fighting indoctrinated children. SS units formed the backbone of the defense, fighting from government offices, police stations, and propaganda buildings. They launched small, vicious counterattacks designed to slow the American advance by minutes or hours, long enough for other German elements to withdraw deeper into the city. These counterattacks, though tactically futile, were psychologically jarring. They came suddenly, without warning, in waves of smoke and automatic fire that shattered any illusion that Munich would fall quietly. As American forces closed in on the city's political quarter, the buildings where the early Nazi Party had once gathered resistance grew especially fierce. Some defenders refused surrender outright. Others attempted to parley only to stall for time. Snipers took last stands inside structures adorned with fading Nazi symbols. Machine gun nests were found barricaded behind piles of propaganda leaflets, posters, and books. Yet the collapse, when it came, was sudden. Once key intersections and bridges were taken, German defences buckled. Civilians began emerging from basements waving makeshift white flags. Hitler Youth squads disintegrated. SS officers fled or fought to the death. By the time American armour rolled into Königsplatz, the fight had drained from the city. Still, the memory lingered. Munich had been expected to crumble easily. Instead, it forced American troops to navigate a city where ideology, fear, and desperation transformed ordinary blocks into pockets of lethal resistance. For those who fought there, Munich was a sobering final reminder. Even in its dying days, the German army and the ideology behind it could turn any street into a battlefield and any ruin into a last stand. As April bled into May 1945, American forces pushed toward the southeastern corner of Germany, a region unlike any they had fought in before. Gone were the broad plains of France and the ruined cities of the Ruhr. Ahead lay the Bavarian Alps, jagged peaks, narrow valleys, dense pine forests, and serpentine roads that twisted through terrain perfectly suited for ambushes. And somewhere within those mountains lay Berchtesgaden, the Nazi leadership's alpine refuge, the symbolic heart of its imagined last stand. Many American soldiers believed they were advancing into the final redoubt of a desperate enemy, ready to fight to the last cartridge. Whether such a redoubt truly existed didn't matter to the troops on the ground. What mattered was what lay in front of them. Miles of mountain passes where visibility collapsed, side roads turned into death funnels, and every blind corner threatened German resistance lurking behind rock faces or tree lines. Units that had grown confident after breaking through the Ruhr now found themselves tightening their grips on rifles and tank hatches once again. The mountains had a way of shrinking entire divisions into vulnerable columns stretched along narrow roads. The Germans defending this region came from a mix of units hardened SS mountain troops, Wehrmacht remnants, police battalions, and groups of fanatics fleeing south from collapsing fronts. They knew the mountains intimately. They placed machine gun nests above switchbacks, using elevation to rake American convoys from above. Mortar teams hid in wooded slopes, firing shells that echoed and multiplied through the valleys, making it nearly impossible to locate their exact positions. Even a small force could hold up an entire battalion simply by controlling a ridge or blocking a pass with a well-placed roadblock. American patrols often moved on foot ahead of the armoured columns, feeling the pressure of the forest closing in around them. Pine needles muffled their steps, but the air carried every metallic clink of a canteen or rifle bolt. Soldiers spoke of the eerie quiet, the kind that made every snapped twig feel like the trigger of an ambush. German snipers took full advantage of this tension. They fired from cliffsides and hidden ledges, retreating upward along goat paths or disappearing into caves that U.S. troops struggled to reach under fire. Tank crews faced some of their most unsettling challenges of the war. Mountain roads left no room for maneuver. A single destroyed vehicle could block an entire column. Panthers and Mark IVs, though fewer in number, used this to their advantage. Positioned around bends or behind stone retaining walls, they fired at point-blank range into advancing Shermans, then reversed up the road before American guns could traverse. Even when German armor was absent, Panzerfaust teams filled the gap, firing from behind rocks, tree stumps, or the doorways of alpine huts. The terrain also made air support unreliable. Clouds clung to the peaks, grounding fighter bombers or forcing them to fly low and fast through narrow valleys, where a single misplaced burst of German flak could tear them from the sky. Without the constant overwatch of Allied aircraft, American units felt exposed, a sensation many had not felt since the early days in Normandy. Logistics grew complicated. Trucks struggled up steep inclines, engines overheating, tires slipping on loose gravel. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin across mountain passes. Medical evacuations required stretcher teams to navigate trails better suited for deer than men carrying wounded comrades. Every function of war, moving, shooting, communicating, became harder in the Alps. Yet despite the challenges, American troops advanced steadily. They cleared ambushes with methodical discipline. Engineers blasted through rock slides and cleared mines placed along cliffside paths. Infantry climbed ridgelines under fire to eliminate sniper nests. Armoured units learned to coordinate movement in tight terrain with painstaking precision. But even as German resistance thinned, the fear remained. The fear that the enemy's last fanatical stand might erupt at any moment from the mountains surrounding them. Some captured German soldiers fed these anxieties, insisting that SS diehards were gathering in the Alps with stockpiles of weapons. Others whispered about fortified tunnels, hidden bunkers, and units preparing for guerrilla warfare. When American troops finally reached Berchtesgaden, they found not the center of a massive alpine fortress, but a symbolic ruin, an empty shell long abandoned by its leaders. Yet the journey there had been a stark reminder of why US soldiers feared the German army from the beginning. Because even at the edge of defeat, surrounded and dwindling, the Germans knew how to turn the land itself into a weapon and make every mile toward victory feel like a final test of endurance. As American forces pushed into the heart of Germany's major cities in the spring of 1945, they encountered structures unlike anything they had faced elsewhere in Europe, colossal fortresses of reinforced concrete rising above the ruins. These were the German Flakturm, or flak towers, part anti-aircraft citadel, part civilian shelter, part last-ditch stronghold. To the Americans watching them loom over shattered neighborhoods, they looked like medieval keeps forged with 20th century engineering. And when the fighting reached their base, U.S. troops discovered why German soldiers considered them nearly indestructible. Flak towers had walls up to 10 feet thick and were built to withstand direct hits from Allied bombs. Their heavy anti-aircraft guns, the infamous 88 seconds and larger, perched on their roofs like the teeth of a metal beast. In peacetime, these towers had been symbols of Nazi engineering pride. In wartime, they became bunkers capable of sheltering tens of thousands of civilians. But, as American forces closed in, the towers transformed into defensive redoubts that German troops used for one final display of stubborn resistance. The first challenge American soldiers faced was simply getting close. Flak towers dominated city blocks, giving defenders a panoramic view of every street, rooftop, and approach path. Machine gun nests positioned on lower levels covered intersections with overlapping arcs of fire. Snipers hid behind narrow firing slits, picking off anyone who tried to move in the open. Even armoured units were hesitant tank shells that would obliterate a building facade, merely chipped the concrete surface of a flak tower, leaving the defenders inside unshaken. Artillery fared no better. Corps-level guns hammered tower positions for hours, sending explosions rolling across rooftops and echoing through ruined districts. Yet when the dust settled, the towers still stood, blackened but unbroken. German crews secure in chambers designed to withstand air raids simply waited out the barrage and resumed firing the moment the shelling eased. The psychological impact on American troops was striking. They were used to seeing German defenses crumble under massed artillery. These towers refused to do so. Inside, German defenders operated in near impenetrable safety. Wehrmacht and SS troops used internal corridors to move supplies and reinforcements between firing points. Mortar teams operated from balconies and auxiliary firing platforms built into the tower structure. Civilians sheltering inside sometimes became unwilling participants in the defense. Other times, they supported defenders by carrying ammunition or tending to wounded soldiers. The blend of military and civilian presence made assaulting the towers even more complex. One wrong move risked a massacre. American infantry attempting to breach the towers faced close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind. Entry points were few and heavily guarded. Germans blocked stairwells with furniture, overturned steel plates, and sandbags, forcing attackers to clear each landing under grenade fire and point-blank bursts of automatic weapons. The interior was a maze of dim corridors, thick doors, and reinforced firing holes that made every foot of progress painfully slow. Flamethrower teams, who usually terrorized defenders in bunkers or pillboxes, found themselves limited by the sheer size of the structure. The towers had ventilation systems that expelled smoke and heat effectively. Grenades rolled uselessly along concrete floors. Even demolition charges struggled to crack the walls. The Americans adapted by surrounding the towers, sealing exits, and waiting out defenders, but even this took time. Some towers fought on for days after the surrounding districts surrendered. German morale inside the towers varied. Some troops were fanatics ready to fight to the last man. Others were frightened, trapped in a fortress that no longer protected anyone from the advancing tide of war. Still, the mere presence of the towers slowed American advances, forced tactical detours, and created pockets of deadly resistance that absorbed manpower and attention. Ultimately, most flak towers did not fall to direct assault. They were isolated, starved of supplies, and convinced to surrender after commanders outside negotiated civilian evacuation. But even in surrender, their towering silhouettes cast a long psychological shadow. They embodied the industrial strength, defensive ingenuity, and stubborn defiance that had made the German army such a feared opponent. For the American soldiers who stood at their base, staring upward at concrete giants still bristling with guns, one thought was unavoidable. If the enemy could build fortresses like this, fortresses that shrugged off artillery, resisted tanks, and forced street-to-street clearance, then defeating them had never been just a matter of firepower. It was a matter of outlasting a defender who turned every asset, every structure, and every inch of ground into something that could fight back. By early 1945, as the German army's veteran formations shattered under the weight of Allied advances, a new kind of defender began appearing on the battlefield, a force that was, in many ways, the clearest sign that the Reich was dying. The Volkssturm was not a standard military unit. It was a last-ditch militia made up of boys too young to serve, men too old to march, and civilians who had never expected to carry a rifle in war. Yet for American troops pushing into the collapsing Reich, these improvised fighters produced some of the most unpredictable, unsettling encounters of the entire campaign. The Volkssturm wore mismatched uniforms, faded Wehrmacht tunics, brown SA shirts, police caps, even civilian coats with a crude armband stitched to the sleeve. Their weapons were equally inconsistent bolt-action rifles from the Great War, hunting shotguns, old Italian carbines, and single-use Panzerfausts handed out by trembling government clerks. Many had only a few rounds of ammunition. Some had none at all and carried grenades instead. And yet, indoctrination and fear drove them to fight with a chaotic determination that shocked American soldiers expecting mass surrenders. The first encounters often began with confusion. Patrols advancing into villages saw elderly men limping toward makeshift barricades, boys with rifles far too large for their frames, or groups of factory workers crouched behind overturned wagons. Some waved white flags, only to open fire moments later. Others fired wildly and fled at the first return shot. Nothing about the Volkssturm felt predictable, and unpredictability was its own kind of danger. What made the Volkssturm particularly troublesome was the terrain they defended. They fought from inside familiar towns, using houses, barns, and civic buildings they had known their entire lives. They dug shallow pits in gardens, fortified attics, and turned basements into last stands. Their lack of training meant they often didn't follow recognizable tactics. They fired from odd angles, charged when retreat made more sense, or held positions long after isolation made them futile. American troops found themselves having to approach every cluster of buildings with extreme caution because a man who had never read a field manual could still lie in wait with a Panzerfaust and kill a Sherman with one lucky shot. Fanatic elements within the Volkssturm posed the worst threat. These were men who believed surrender meant execution, or boys filled with propaganda from their schoolmasters. They ambushed American patrols from tree lines, fired Panzerfausts from haylofts, and detonated charges beneath vehicles. In one captured town, a lone Volkssturm fighter hid inside a collapsed bakery for 2 days, firing on any soldier who approached until flamethrowers flushed him out. Such acts of defiance had no strategic impact, but they sowed uncertainty, forcing U.S. units to expend time, ammunition, and lives on enemies who should never have been soldiers to begin with. American troops quickly learned to differentiate between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to flee. Many Volkssturm surrendered en masse at the first opportunity, dropping weapons and begging for mercy. But the danger was that even among a group surrendering, one fanatic might fire, provoking U.S. troops into chaotic engagements and forcing them to respond with overwhelming firepower. Villages became scenes of tragic confusion. Children in Hitler Youth uniforms firing their only round before collapsing in fear. Elderly men clutching rifles they didn't know how to load. Civilians trapped between the threat of German execution squads behind them and American battle lines in front. The presence of the Volkssturm also complicated American rules of engagement. Was the old man with a shovel just clearing debris or burying an anti-tank mine? Was the teenager running across a yard retrieving firewood or a Panzerfaust? Every silhouette became a question mark, and hesitation on a battlefield where Panzerfausts lurked behind every corner could be fatal. In the end, the Volkssturm was less a fighting force than a symbol of a nation unraveling an army created from desperation, fear, and ideology, rather than training or strength. But for American soldiers on the ground, they represented a unique kind of threat, not because they were skilled, but because they were unpredictable, close at hand, and often driven by the belief that death was preferable to surrender. Facing the Volkssturm reminded U.S. troops that even as Germany collapsed, danger did not diminish. It became stranger, more chaotic, and more personal, turning the dying days of the war into some of its most psychologically demanding battles. By the final months of 1945, the German army was a fractured shadow of its former strength, but the Waffen-SS, in many sectors, continued to fight with a ferocity that stunned even veteran American units. The SS were not simply soldiers, they were ideological warriors, bred through years of indoctrination to believe that surrender was treason and defeat was impossible, and as the Reich collapsed around them, many SS units fought with the desperation of men convinced that their only choices were victory or annihilation. For American troops, the final encounters with SS formations were among the most intense, savage, and psychologically draining of the entire war. Unlike the Volkssturm or the thinning Wehrmacht divisions, SS units arrived at battlefields in tight, disciplined formations. Even in ragged uniforms, even with shortages of ammunition and supplies, they moved with cohesion and purpose. Their officers shouted commands with the clipped authority of men who expected instant obedience. Their machine gunners positioned weapons with veteran expertise. Their snipers, often among the best marksmen remaining in the German military, chose their shots carefully, targeting medics, radio operators, officers, and tank commanders to break the backbone of American units. The first sign of an SS presence was often the intensity of the resistance. Towns that American forces expected to clear within hours turned into prolonged engagements. Streets became firing corridors. Courtyards erupted in grenades. Stairwells turned into killing grounds. An SS squad might fight from the basement of a building until grenades cleared them, only for another squad to counterattack from the floor above. Every room felt contested. Every doorway felt trapped. What made the SS particularly dangerous was their ability to blend veteran tactical skill with fanatical resolve. They used every advantage of the terrain: collapsed walls, craters, sewer access points, industrial ruins, and wooded ridgelines. They held fire until American troops were in optimal kill zones, then unleashed devastating bursts from MG-42 machine guns that pinned entire companies. Even when outnumbered, SS units executed coordinated withdrawals, only to reappear on the flanks minutes later, striking in sudden, disciplined counterattacks that left U.S. soldiers scrambling to reset defensive positions. Many SS units fought to the last man. In small villages, American patrols would breach buildings, expecting surrender only to be met with point-blank gunfire from defenders who had vowed not to survive the battle. Mortar teams continued firing until their positions were overrun. Anti-tank crews held their posts, even as American armor closed within yards. Captured SS soldiers often refused treatment or interrogation, maintaining silence even as wounds bled through their uniforms. This fanaticism had a chilling effect on American troops. Fighting an enemy who refused to surrender meant that every firefight lasted longer, hit harder, and demanded more caution. Soldiers advancing through forests or towns learned not to assume that silence meant safety. An SS unit might lie still for hours, letting American lines pass by before firing into their rear. Some SS elements executed nighttime infiltration attacks, slipping through rubble or undergrowth to strike isolated posts before disappearing again into the dark. Psychological warfare was a subtle but potent part of SS resistance. They left propaganda leaflets in abandoned positions, warning Americans of ambushes or boasting of imminent German victory. They used loudspeakers to broadcast taunts and threats. In some sectors, they mutilated fallen soldiers not as strategy, but as ideological hate, leaving behind scenes meant to unnerve US troops before the next battle. Even when defeat was unavoidable, SS units fought on. In one captured town, American soldiers found an SS company still holding defensive positions despite having no ammunition left. They had armed themselves with farming tools and prepared to fight hand to hand. In another, an SS battalion launched a suicidal counterattack with bayonets and panzerfausts, screaming slogans as they charged through artillery fire. Not all SS units fought this way. Some surrendered when surrounded, exhausted, or outnumbered. But for those that did not, the intensity of the fighting seared itself into the memories of American veterans. The SS represented the most extreme manifestation of the enemy's resolve, a reminder that ideology, when fused with discipline and desperation, could produce adversaries who fought with terrifying abandon. For U.S. troops, the SS were the embodiment of the German army they had feared since Normandy. Not because they were invincible, but because they refused to die quietly, refused to surrender, and refused to stop firing until they were physically incapable of resistance. Facing them in the war's final days was not a relief. It was a final trial, a brutal confirmation that the enemy would fight to the bitter end, even as his world collapsed into ashes around him. By April 1945, most American units believed the German army had nothing left to give. Major cities had fallen, supply lines were shattered, and entire divisions surrendered daily. Yet as US forces approached Germany's eastern rivers, the Elbe, the Mulde, the Saale, they discovered that the war's final bridgeheads would be among the most unexpectedly violent of the entire campaign. Here, with defeat unmistakable and collapse inevitable, German forces still fought tooth and nail to hold river crossings that no longer held strategic meaning. For American soldiers, these battles felt surreal. Brutal, costly engagements, fought in the shadow of a surrender everyone knew was coming. The first sign that the river lines would not fall quietly came in the form of sudden, precise German artillery strikes. Even as ammunition dwindled to a fraction of wartime stockpiles, German commanders concentrated their remaining shells at key crossing points. American engineers attempting to build pontoon bridges found themselves under heavy fire from batteries hidden in tree lines or concealed behind farmhouses. Shells splashed into the water with violent eruptions, sending shrapnel into boats and forcing construction crews to scatter for cover along the muddy banks. Infantry advances toward the waterline were equally hazardous. German machine gun teams often deployed in pairs to maximize overlapping fields of fire dug into embankments and old fortifications. From these positions, they swept the river approaches with disciplined bursts that pinned down entire platoons. Snipers positioned themselves in church towers, abandoned mills, and haylofts. Even a single marksman could stall an American crossing for hours. The defenders were a mixture of exhausted Wehrmacht troops, SS remnants, Hitler Youth detachments, and foreign volunteers who had nowhere left to retreat. Many believed the eastern bank would fall to the Soviets within days or hours, and that holding the western bank against the Americans offered the only slim chance of surrendering to a more merciful enemy. This desperation fueled a willingness to fight with startling intensity. American troops approaching these bridgeheads described the eerie sensation of advancing toward an enemy who was, by all logic, beaten, yet fought with the precision of soldiers still expecting victory. In some towns, white flags hung from windows, while, just a few hundred yards away, German machine gunners fired relentlessly from sandbagged positions. Civilians begged the remaining soldiers to surrender, but fanatic commanders ordered them to fight on, declaring that any withdrawal was treason. Nighttime brought new dangers. German raiding teams slipped across the rivers in small boats, launching sudden attacks on isolated American positions. These raids often involved only a handful of men, but they were well coordinated, striking with grenades and automatic fire before disappearing back into the darkness. The attacks served little tactical purpose but kept American troops on edge, forcing units to maintain heightened vigilance long after the front had collapsed elsewhere. Engineers bore the brunt of the risk. Constructing pontoon bridges under fire required precision and iron nerves. Men waded into cold, fast-moving water, carrying heavy sections of floating platform, while mortar rounds fell nearby. Boats used to ferry troops across the rivers were easy targets for German anti-tank rifles and Panzerfausts. More than one crossing saw an entire assault boat destroyed mid-river, disappearing in a plume of water and fire. Tank units, usually the backbone of American advances, found themselves limited by the terrain. Riverbanks were soft and easily churned into mud. Crossing points were narrow and exposed. German Panzerfaust teams targeted tanks the moment they reached the far shore. A single hit could ignite a Sherman and block the crossing for hours, turning the bridgehead into a deadly choke point. Yet despite the ferocity of the defense, American troops gradually secured the crossings. Once a foothold was established, U.S. artillery and armor pushed forward with overwhelming force. German lines, already strained beyond breaking, began to disintegrate. Groups of defenders surrendered by the dozens. Others tried to flee east, only to find roads clogged with civilians and retreating troops. A few fought to the bitter end, firing until American units overran their final trenches. For those who fought in these last river battles, the memory lingered. They had expected surrender, not sudden, deadly resistance. They had expected retreat, not coordinated, machine gun fire and nighttime raids. The experience reinforced a truth they had learned over and over throughout the campaign. The German army did not collapse cleanly. Even with defeat certain, it fought with skill, discipline, and stubborn resolve. The final bridgeheads were not mere footnotes to victory. They were the closing chapters of a war where the enemy's capacity to resist, to defy logic, to prolong suffering, to fight when there was nothing left to fight for, remained as dangerous as ever. By late April and into early May 1945, One of the strangest and most tense phases of the war began a period when the German army was simultaneously collapsing and still resisting, surrendering in waves while certain units continued fighting with lethal resolve. For American soldiers advancing into the final pockets of German territory, this contradiction created a battlefield like no other. A place where white flags meant safety 1 hour and a deadly trap the next. These surrender standoffs became some of the most psychologically taxing encounters of the entire campaign. At first glance, towns appeared ready to capitulate. Civilians tied sheets to broomsticks, waved scarves from balconies, or stepped into the streets with hands raised. Groups of German soldiers marched toward American lines, with rifles slung upside down, the traditional signal of surrender. But just beyond these groups, other German units refused to yield. Machine gunners fired from barns, snipers remained hidden in church towers, mortar teams continued to launch shells. The result was a battlefield in which enemy intentions were agonizingly unclear. American infantry approaching these areas moved with extreme caution. A platoon might advance under a flag of truce to accept a surrender, only to be met with sudden bursts of machine gun fire from a cross street. Soldiers described the surreal experience of watching one German unit surrender peacefully, while another, hidden in the same block, opened fire. Sometimes the fanatical element consisted of only a handful of men, SS stragglers or Hitler Youth, convinced surrender was worse than death, but their resistance risked turning the entire area into chaos. It didn't help that the German command structure had collapsed. Some officers ordered surrender, others threatened anyone who considered it. Civilians begged soldiers to lay down their weapons. Local Nazi officials insisted on fighting to the last man. In many towns, these conflicting voices collided inside cramped command posts or basements where decisions were made at gunpoint. When American forces arrived, they stepped into the aftermath of these grim internal struggles. One of the gravest dangers during these standoffs came from booby traps. German engineers, acting under earlier orders, had rigged buildings, bridges, and vehicles with explosives meant to detonate if Allies tried to use them. Even when surrender seemed genuine, American units discovered mines wired to cellar doors, grenades tied to doorknobs, or charges hidden beneath white flags themselves. Engineers had to clear every structure cautiously, knowing that a surrender in words did not always match reality in the streets. Artillery fire added another layer of confusion. In some sectors, German units that had not yet surrendered continued shelling American positions, unaware or unconcerned that German troops in nearby towns were trying to give up peacefully. The shelling killed civilians attempting to surrender and wounded American soldiers walking out to accept prisoners. It also reinforced to US commanders that even in these final days, lowering their guard could be fatal. Nightfall made everything worse. Darkness emboldened German soldiers who refused surrender. They launched small raids, fired sporadically into American lines, or crept through alleys trying to escape eastward. U.S. patrols conducting nighttime sweeps found abandoned weapons, burned documents, and bodies of German soldiers who had been executed by their own officers for attempting surrender. Every discovery added to the sense that the war was ending unevenly, violently for some, mercifully for others. One particular challenge was separating genuine surrendering soldiers from those who pretended to yield only to attack at close range. Incidents occurred where German troops approached with hands raised, then dropped to the ground and opened fire the moment Americans stepped forward. As these attacks circulated through U.S. ranks, trust evaporated. Troops approached every surrender with weapons drawn, fingers tense on triggers, eyes scanning rooftops and windows. What should have been a moment of relief, instead, became a test of restraint and judgment. Still, many German soldiers surrendered honorably. Groups in the hundreds, worn down, hungry, and disillusioned, marched toward American lines, with relief etched into their faces. Some directly apologized, others said nothing, too exhausted to speak, but their presence didn't erase the danger. A single fanatic hidden among them could still spark tragedy. The surrender standoffs were a final lesson for U.S. troops. The German army did not disintegrate cleanly. It fractured violently, unevenly, unpredictably. Peace came in pieces, town by town, hour by hour, and sometimes only after bullets flew even under the shadow of a white flag. For those Americans on the front lines, these final days did not feel like the end of a war. They felt like a coin, constantly flipping, one side surrender, the other side death, and no one could predict which would land face up when they stepped into the next town. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, American soldiers had marched through cities reduced to ash, crossed rivers under fire, and stared down ambushes from enemies who refused to collapse even when the war was finished, in all but name. Yet for many of these men, the end brought no clean emotional release. Instead, it revealed the deeper truth behind why US troops had feared facing the German army from the very beginning. Because the German way of war left marks that did not fade when the shooting stopped. Fear had never been just about the weapons, though the Germans had plenty worth fearing. It was not just the 88 seconds, the Panzers, the MG 42 seconds, or the rockets that screamed overhead like tearing metal. It was the mentality behind them, the discipline, the precision, the relentless manner in which German forces imposed order on chaos and turned every battlefield, from a French hedgerow to an Alpine road, into an arena where mistakes were punished instantly and brutally. As the campaign ended, American soldiers found themselves replaying scenes that would stay with them for life. A hedgerow that had erupted with unseen fire, a machine gun nest that kept firing even after every man inside was dead, a sniper's bullet that came from nowhere and struck the man walking 2 steps ahead, the tanks that exploded without warning, the civilians who begged for mercy while fanatics fired from behind their homes. Victory did not erase these moments. It simply froze them in memory. Many soldiers admitted privately that the constant unpredictability of German resistance had changed how they looked at silence, shadows, or open fields. Even after the surrender, when they patrolled quiet towns or guarded bridges no one would ever attack again, they still scanned windows, rooftops, and tree lines, muscle memory of an enemy who always seemed ready with one more ambush, one more counterattack, one more refusal to die quietly. The psychological strain had begun long before Germany itself. Normandy had introduced the Americans to a level of defensive skill they had never seen. The Hürtgen Forest ground divisions into fragments. The Ardennes counteroffensive proved the enemy could still strike with terrifying speed. The Siegfried Line forced men to crawl through terrain where machine gun fire and artillery seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, inside Germany, they found an enemy who fought harder. As the situation worsened, SS fanatics willing to die, Volkssturm children firing Panzerfausts, and Wehrmacht veterans executing defences with brutal efficiency. Even the final days offered no peace. White flags sometimes concealed traps. Booby-trapped buildings trembled on the edge of detonation. Snipers fired long after towns had surrendered. German units fought with the desperation of men who knew their world was collapsing, and that desperation made them unpredictable, sometimes suicidal, and often more dangerous than ever. American soldiers feared this enemy because he made them doubt every assumption about safety. No building was fully cleared. No path was guaranteed safe. No silence meant the fight was truly over. When the war finally ended, that doubt remained. Some men said they could still feel Germans in the trees, even months later, as if the enemy's discipline and camouflage had left an imprint on the landscape itself. Others admitted that they trusted no lull in combat because too many lulls had been shattered by sudden mortar fire or an MG 42 bursting to life from a hidden nest. And many carried with them the uneasy respect that comes from knowing an enemy fought with skill, resolve, and expertise even when defeat was certain. In the end, fear had not been weakness. It had been recognition, a soldier's instinctive understanding that the German army, for all its brutality and ideological madness, was an opponent capable of turning every battlefield into a test of nerve and endurance. Victory came, but the lessons remained. The men who crossed Europe knew that the German army had been feared not because it was invincible, but because it never stopped fighting like it might be, even in its dying breath, even as the world closed in around it. And long after the uniforms were stored away and the battlefields grew quiet, that memory lingered, the knowledge that some enemies don't just fight you, they change you.